Chapter 881. It was almost time for dinner. Mag had decided on a recipe for eggplant with garlic sauce, but he still needed to experiment with the exact amount of ingredients and condiments. Without the experience of a master chef and a precise recipe, it was undoubtedly a new challenge for Mag. Not only did he have to be patient, but he also had to apply his understanding of cooking in a comprehensive way to make eggplant with garlic sauce to his satisfaction. Putting away his pen and paper, Meg walked to the kitchen door. Phyllis hadn't brought out the kebabs for him to try yet, so he was curious about her progress. "It seems that my amazing talent didn't come into play when it came to kebabs," Meg said with a smile as he stood at the door and looked at Phyllis, who was standing nervously in front of the grill. Her forehead was dotted with tiny beads of sweat, and she stared intently at the kebab on the grill. Her hands were a little stiff, and it was as if she were holding something that could explode at any moment. On the plate beside her hand, there was a small mountain of failed products. Some of them were as black as charcoal, some of them even had their bamboo skewers burnt off, and some of them were half-cooked. None of them could be seen, let alone eaten. Meg glanced at the burnt kebabs in Phyllis's hands and walked into the kitchen. Looking at the disheartened Phyllis, he said with a smile, "You're as good as I was when I first started." Phyllis, who had been disheartened, turned around and looked at Meg in disbelief. "Were you like this when you first started?" "I'm not a genius chef. I'm just a little luckier and more hardworking than others." Meg nodded with a smile and said in his heart, "Of course, the first point is more important." Confidence reappeared in Phyllis's eyes. Meg threw the kebabs that Phyllis had failed to make into the kitchen waste bin, tidied up the stove, and said with a smile, "That's all for today's practice. When you start work the day after tomorrow, you'll be responsible for preparing all the ingredients that need to be used with knives. You can practice in the restaurant. If you have something to do tonight, you can leave after dinner. If you have nothing to do, you can also stay in the restaurant. If it's possible, I'd like to see you cook." Phyllis looked at Meg with bright eyes. Before this, the only person she admired in her heart was the princess, but now there was one more. "It's up to you. I'll arrange a place for you tonight." Meg nodded slightly. It was a good thing that Phyllis was eager to learn. He hoped more than anyone else that she could grow into a chef who could take charge of her own business as soon as possible, so that he could be liberated slowly. As for the accommodation, Meg had already thought of expanding the dormitory that Mia and the others were currently living in into a 4-bedroom dormitory. Anyway, there was still a large empty space next to it. When he built the dormitory for Mia and the others, he had asked the system to reserve 2 spaces. After the rooms were built, he could just open the door and it would not affect the layout at all. "By the way, what style do you like in your room?" Meg suddenly looked up at Phyllis, who was tidying up the room, and asked. "Huh?" Phyllis was a little confused. "Well, I'm going to arrange a dormitory for you. What kind of decoration or color do you like?" Meg explained. After what happened last time, he had decided not to guess what a woman was thinking. Phyllis's heart warmed. Except for Her Highness, no one had ever asked her what she wanted, and no one had ever considered what she liked. Meg not only taught her how to cook, but he had also been so considerate of her. Looking at the gentle smile on his face, Phyllis's heart thumped loudly, and she said softly, I like something simple. It doesn't need to be too luxurious, just something simple." After saying that, Phyllis stole a glance at Meg again, and said somewhat worriedly, "This way, aren't my requirements too high? Isn't this the same as not having any requirements?" Meg smiled and shook his head. The little girl was still too shy, but if she wanted to be simple and elegant, it would be easy. It seemed that she still retained many of the instincts of an elf. Meg and the system haggled for a while, and finally added a dormitory for Phyllis at the price of 30,000 coins, as well as the packaging and all the furniture. "Father, the children are going to have a parent-teacher conference. Do you want to go?" Amy asked as soon as she came home from school. "A parent-teacher conference?" Meg looked at Amy, who was carrying a small backpack, with surprise. Crassus and Julian came to the restaurant every day to eat, which meant that they came to visit every day. Furthermore, Amy was their only student. Did they have to have a parent-teacher conference? Yes. When Daphne came to play with me after school, She told me that all the children's parents will be there. You'll be there too, right? Amy nodded her little head and looked at Meg with her big blue eyes full of anticipation. So it's a unified student conference for the students of Chaos School. Meg understood, but he was a little anxious when he saw Amy's expectant gaze. Amy was studying magic with Crassus and Julian every day. She didn't have any followers at Chaos School, and Crassus hadn't notified her at all. But looking at Amy's expectant gaze, Meg couldn't bear to turn her down. He smiled and stroked Amy's head, and said, "It's Amy's first parent-teacher conference. Of course I'll be there." "That's great." Amy jumped up happily. She hugged Meg's arm and swung it from side to side. "Father, you're the best." Phyllis stood at the kitchen door and looked at this scene with a smile on her face. This father and daughter were so loving at all times. It was enviable and heartwarming. But Daphne said that both father and mother have to be present at this parent-teacher conference. Amy's voice trailed off as she looked at Meg carefully. "In that case." Meg also pondered. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. "Why don't we find someone to replace them?" Both of them turned to look at Phyllis with contemplative looks on their faces. Phyllis, who had been a little worried, was stunned. Her heart started to pound like a little deer. Although she had promised to help Boss take care of the child before coming, she didn't have to pretend to be the child's mother, did she? But, looking at the delicate and adorable Amy and the mature and gentle Meg, Phyllis's heart softened again. It's not easy for a man to take care of a child by himself. If mother doesn't go to the parent-teacher conference, she'll definitely be criticized, right? In that case, I'll reluctantly agree. I don't think so. Big sister Bean Sprout is too small. Amy shook her head. Yes, and she's too young. She still looks like a child. Meg nodded in agreement. Chapter 882. It was snowing all year round on the ice-blue Frost Island. White frost dragons could be seen gliding across the sky from time to time. The palaces that stood in this world of ice and snow were all very grand. They were like icicles standing tall. In a grand palace, a few figures were sitting in the main seats. Fox was sitting in the main seat, and the other 5 were old men with white hair and beards. An old man sitting in the front seat looked at Fox, and said in a low voice, "Fox, if you want to become the chief, you have to prove that Rankster is dead. Otherwise, Douglas won't agree so easily." Another old man nodded. Yes. Rankster was severely injured in the battle with Alex. 3 years ago, he disappeared with Alex almost at the same time. In the past 3 years, the Frost Dragons have searched the entire continent, but they couldn't find any trace of him. They only found a few of his belongings, but didn't find his body. Fox's expression was a little ferocious. His life fire was extinguished 2 years ago. According to the teachings of the dragons, the extinguishing of life fire means death. Why does Douglas still refuse to admit that Rankster is dead? Could it be that he was beaten silly by Rankster back then? Although his life fire in our Frost Dragon tribe has extinguished, his life fire in the Golden Dragon tribe is still lit. Although it's extremely weak, this alone proves that he's still alive. At least his soul hasn't dissipated. Rankster is very good at living. This has been proven time and again since he was born, an old man said calmly. The palace fell silent. Although they didn't want to admit it, this was a saying that had been passed down on Dragon Island for the past 1,000 years. No one could refute it. Although Rankster was born in the noble Frost Dragon tribe, his mother was from the Golden Dragon tribe. Back then, the Golden Dragons and Frost Dragons fought each other, and countless people died. The hatred was unresolvable. Rankster, who was still in the womb, was sentenced to death. However, after he was born, his mother risked her life to send him to the Frost Dragon tribe. Douglas, the chief of the Frost Dragon tribe, threw Rankster, who he had just received, off the Frost Island and continued the war with the Golden Dragons. 20 years later, Rankster, who everyone thought was dead, appeared on Dragon Island again and began his legendary life. He defeated countless powerhouses of the Golden Dragon and Frost Dragon tribes on his own. Stepping on mountains of corpses and seas of blood, he forced Douglas, who had thrown him off Dragon Island, to abdicate and become the chief of the Frost Dragon tribe, ending the war between the two tribes that lasted for almost 1,000 years. To come to the frost dragon to come back to life. But every time. To come back to life to come back. Back then, Rankster's power was already among the top 3 on Dragon Island, and he had an unshakable position. However, it was this unstoppable Rankster who met Alex, who was also at his peak, 10 years ago. 2 to the. Alex won. He was also seriously injured. Then, he began his journey to slay dragons. No one knew how serious Rankster's injuries were. But before this, he had never gone into seclusion because of his injuries. Moreover, he had gone into seclusion for 7 years. 3 years ago, the news of Alex being killed in Rodu reached Dragon Island. Rankster came out of seclusion and disappeared. His whereabouts were unknown. Some said that he didn't believe that Alex was dead, and went to look for him. Some said that he had lost interest in life and committed suicide because he had lost the opponent he wanted to defeat the most in his life. But one thing was for sure, from then on, the flamboyant Frost Dragon chief had completely disappeared. Without a leader, the Frost Dragon tribe naturally discussed the matter of electing a new chief. Douglas, who had been forced to retreat by Rankster, was expected to be the chief. But no one expected him to reject this. He even instructed them to put this matter aside and look for Rankster. He also said that even if they couldn't find Rankster, the position of chief had to be handed over to the younger dragons so that the younger ones could lead the Frost Dragons forward. There was still no news from Rankster, but the second half of the sentence made many of the Frost Dragon tribe's members think about it. Among the younger generation, Fox was Rankster's half-brother. They were very close, and he was a 9th-tier powerhouse. Although he was far from Rankster, he was undoubtedly the most powerful person in his generation. There was also Rankster's only daughter, Elizabeth, who was the center of attention. Elizabeth had the pure Frost Dragon bloodline and inherited Rankster's powerful talent. She had already broken through to the 7th tier before she reached adulthood. She had hopes of breaking through to the 10th tier before she was 100 years old. With the lifespan of the dragon tribe of thousands of years, such talent was enough to be called a rare genius. However, because Rankster's way of getting the position was too tragic, and he had the bloodline of both the Frost Dragon and the Golden Dragon tribe, not many people chose to support Elizabeth after losing his powerful deterrence. But because Douglas had protected Elizabeth several times, many people chose to wait and see. They didn't choose a side easily. The Golden Colossal Dragons were even more forceful in expressing their support for Elizabeth's ascension to the throne. The throne was so close, but he could only watch helplessly. How could Fox be satisfied? If it wasn't for Rankster's posthumous son, he would have been the chief of the Frost Dragon tribe long ago. Fox clenched his fists, and said, "Since Alex is not dead, if Rankster is not dead, he should be coming out now, right? With his personality, he will definitely challenge Alex to a duel again, right? If he is killed by Alex, then I will be the chief, right? If Elizabeth is also dead, you will be the chief." A cold voice sounded from the corner. "Big sister Mia has horns on her head, but I don't, so I definitely can't. Big sister Barbara also looks very young, and she is really very young. She is indeed very young, so she definitely can't." At the dining table, Amy and Meg ignored Barbara, who was blushing because of the 3 little girls. Their gazes landed on Sally at the same time. If that's the case, big sister Aisha seems to be the most suitable. She is a mature and beautiful elf. Amy looked at Sally and nodded with satisfaction. Then, she looked at Meg with a smile, and said, "Of course, if father doesn't mind, I think big brother Blower would look good in female clothes too. I refuse." Chapter 883. Have you tried Mr. Mac's new dish? That stinky tofu that's said to be extremely smelly? I don't dare to try it. Yeah, it stinks. You'd better not try it. After all, there are only 100 servings a day. Outside Mammoth, the discussion about stinky tofu was more heated than the tofu pudding, which was rare. "Carla, why did you bring me here so mysteriously today? Don't tell me you want me to try that stinky tofu?" In the group, a woman in a purple gold uniform looked suspiciously at the woman in pink standing in front of her. Although Chris was only 23 years old, she was now the manager of a branch of Buffett Banks. She had entered the bank at the age of 18, and with her outstanding performance, she had been promoted again and again. She was also a little famous in the Buffett family. Carla was her best friend. Her family owned more than a dozen mines in the Goblins' territory. They had become close friends because of their work. Carla loved good food, so she often took Chris to all kinds of restaurants or eat strange things. Chris felt a little helpless, but as long as she was free, she would accompany Carla to eat. However, she had a bottom line. She would never eat food that was dirty or had a strange taste. Besides, the customers she served were all upper-class people, so she cared more about her image. After all, it was related to her professionalism. She was going to attend a banquet tonight. She had been preparing for a big deal for a long time, and whether it would succeed or not depended on tonight. Therefore, she refused to eat anything with a strange smell. She had heard about this restaurant many times from Carla, but she had missed it the last few times because she was busy. Tonight's banquet would start late, but she couldn't resist Carla's coaxing and pestering, so she came with her. She planned to go back after eating something and change into a formal dress to attend the banquet. Of course not. When did I recommend you to eat stinky food? The owner of this restaurant is really something. He went to Rodu to cook for the king of the Roth Empire and won the best dish at the palace banquet. You haven't had the chance to try it before, so you have to try it this time. Carla looked serious. Then she whispered in Chris's ear, besides, the owner is super handsome. He should be your type. You're so talkative. Chris smiled and patted Carla's head. She was curious about the boss who won the best award at the palace banquet. Not being able to eat to your heart's content is really torturous. However, what the doctor said today is similar to what Mr. Mack said. In order to live a few more years and eat a few more years of good food, it's better to restrain yourself a little. Abraham, who was in front of Chris and the others in the line, sighed and looked a little lost. Welcome. The bell on the door rang, and the door of the restaurant opened. Meg stood at the door, looking at everyone with a smile. This person. Chris's eyes slightly brightened. The close-fitting black and white chef's uniform made his tall figure seem even more upright. He was different from the greasy appearance of ordinary chefs. Not even the slightest trace of oil could be seen on his apron. His white skin was also very natural. The two tufts of mustache on his upper lip made his handsome face look much more mature and steady. His black eyes were clear and bright. What do you think? Is he the young man you like? Although he has a little daughter, she is also super cute. I feel that if you marry him and get a little angel, you'll make a lot of money, Carla said with a smile. Daughter. Chris was a little surprised. Amy came out from behind Meg and said seriously, everyone, please follow the order when you eat. Remember to pay. Otherwise, Amy will be angry. If Amy is angry, the consequences will be very serious. The cute little fairy, who was like an ice sculpture, was saying harsh words. The customers in the line at the entrance of the restaurant all showed kind smiles on their faces. Little boss is deliberately acting cute. She's so cute. Every time you feel depressed, come to Amy's to eat something delicious. Look at little boss for a while, and your mood will always be better. Is this the boss's daughter? She looks so cute, and the way she talks is so cute. Just for this, I have to eat here tonight. If only I could marry Mr. Mack. I would have a handsome husband who can cook, and a cute and strong daughter. I would be a winner in life. The crowd was in an uproar. She's so cute. Chris looked at Amy, who was standing beside Meg, and felt like her heart had been hit. She was usually busy with work, so she had no feelings for children. She even thought that if she had children, they would be a burden. But now, looking at Amy, she couldn't help but think that she would be very happy to have such a cute daughter. I heard that Amy's doesn't have a lady boss. Do you want to try? This is the man that all the girls in Chaos City have their eyes on. I'll let you have him. If you become the owner's wife in the future, I don't need you to give me a free meal. Just buy me one more serving of tofu pudding every day. It's the best product for beauty, Carla said, egging her on. Chris touched Carla's head helplessly. You're not sick. Why are you fantasizing? If you let me have him, there are thousands of foodie girls out there. Besides, I don't want to be the lady boss now. My career is the most important thing. Okay. I know you put your career first. Carla removed Chris's hand from her forehead and smiled slyly. But I think you won't think so after you try Mr. Mac's food. Please come in. Meg smiled and touched Amy's head. Now, Amy was the restaurant's security manager. She was the restaurant's security manager. She would deter and punish customers who tried to cheat, dine and dash, or deliberately provoke the restaurant's order. The effect was surprisingly good. Meg and Amy stood aside and let them through the door. The customers entered the restaurant one by one. They greeted Meg and Amy with familiarity. Meg responded to them with a smile. Mr. Mac is so handsome today. Carla walked to the door and smiled sweetly at Meg. Father is handsome every day, so he won't give you an extra serving of tofu pudding, Amy said with a smile before Meg could say anything. Carla. Chapter 884. Thank you, Carla said as she walked into the restaurant. A hint of surprise appeared on Christie's face. It was very rare for her to see Carla being rejected. In other restaurants, she would be treated like a VIP, but here, she couldn't even get an extra helping of tofu pudding. She nodded politely at Mag, and then couldn't help but take a glance at Amy before entering the restaurant. Mag's gaze also paused on Christie for a moment. She was a beauty that made people want to take a second look at her. Her light blonde hair was tied up in a neat yet elegant manner. Her purple-gold uniform was similar to the office lady's uniform in the modern workplace. Her light brown eyes were confident and approachable. Mag also recognized the badge pinned to her chest. In fact, there were very few people in Chaos City who didn't recognize it. It should be one of the middle managers of Buffett Banks, right? Meg glanced at the information that popped out of the omniscient door. Christie, female, 23 years old. Her body functions are generally healthy. There is a small area of inflammation in her stomach that is showing signs of spreading. Young people tend to forget to eat when they are busy with work. Mag shook his head. To be able to climb to the management level at such a young age, unless she was bed climbing, she wouldn't have been able to do it without some effort. Of course, Meg didn't think anyone could climb to a bed on the hill, so this beautiful girl must be very capable. Meg walked to the kitchen with a smile. From today onwards, we will only serve 100 stinky tofu at night. Because the quantity is limited, each person is limited to one serving. Customers who want to order stinky tofu, please sit in this row, Yarbemia said loudly with a smile. 100 servings. A limited order. Mr. Mac. You are so cruel. This is even crueler than tofu pudding. The customers who had tasted the stinky tofu yesterday were all crying out. There were too many wolves and too little meat. It seemed that they would have to rely on their luck to eat the stinky tofu in the future. Let's sit here, Christie. Carla pulled Christie to a seat near the wall. You want to eat that stinky tofu? Chris suddenly stopped in her tracks. Carla said with a serious face, I promise that it's really a rumor. If you taste it yourself, you will definitely fall in love with the taste. It's addictive. But, it stinks. Chris still shook her head. If you really don't want to eat. Carla rolled her eyes and whispered in Chris's ear, then you can order one more for me. I'll eat it all. Now we can only order one. Please. Chris knew that Carla loved good food. Her heart softened, and she nodded. I really don't want to eat. I have to attend a banquet tonight, so I can only eat a little bit. Carla nodded. I'm sorry. I have to attend a banquet tonight, so I can only eat a little. I know. I'll recommend you some food later. You definitely won't be full. A smile appeared on Carla's face. However, in Amy's, there are only two options, finish eating or not eating. I have never seen anyone who only eats a little. Then you will see it today, Chris said. Carla and Chris sat down across from Abraham and Harrison, nodding slightly as a greeting. When they entered the restaurant, Chris had already looked around. Even a picky person like her had to admit that this was the cleanest restaurant she had ever seen. The tables, chairs, floor, ceiling, and even the corners blocked by flower pots were all spotless. The air was very fresh, and she could smell a faint hint of mint. It was very light, but it made the air more refreshing. It was just that she was not used to sharing a table with strangers. However, seeing that Carla did not mind at all, and the guests in the restaurant were sitting casually, even elves and demons sitting at the same table, Carla felt that it was strange, so she did not say anything. Out of professional habit, she quietly looked at the two people sitting across from her. The fat young man on the left was wearing a luxurious robe with a thick gold chain around his neck. He seemed to be from a well-off family, but he did not have much of a background. He belonged to the emerging middle class. She then looked at the one on the right. He was about 40 years old and wore a soft grey silk robe. Chris's gaze stopped on the jade ring on his right thumb. She was slightly surprised. That was the best quality Feelers jadeite produced in the Feelers mountain range mine on the main island of Dragon Island. At first glance, it looked no different from ordinary jadeite, but within the green jadeite, there were strands of golden threads as thin as hair. Such a small piece of jadeite could dispel the cold and dissipate heat, allowing the body to maintain a comfortable temperature. Feelers jade was produced in very small quantities, and rarely left Dragon Island. It was a precious collection of giant dragons. It was priceless on the Norland continent. Every time it appeared, it would be sold at a sky-high price. And the man in front of her actually had such a piece of jade. If he wasn't an extremely wealthy person, then he must be a person with an extremely high position. I don't know this man among the rich in Chaos City, and he's not from the City Lord's castle or the Grey Temple. I heard that Duke Abraham of the Roth Empire came to Chaos City 2 days ago and exchanged some gold coins from the bank. Could it be? Chris guessed the man's identity, and the surprise in her eyes deepened. Duke Abraham was such a noble that even the City Lord had to treat him as an honored guest. How could he be sharing a table with someone in this restaurant? While Chris was in a daze, Abraham looked around and leaned forward. He whispered, "Little girl, do you want to eat stinky tofu too? Can't we discuss something? I'll buy your stinky tofu at 5 times the price." Huh? Chris was taken aback. She looked at Abraham's serious face with mixed feelings. How could a duke like him buy more stinky tofu from them so carefully? What's wrong with this world? Is stinky tofu really that good? Uncle, I'll pay you 10 times the price. Can you sell your stinky tofu to me? Carla also leaned forward and lowered her voice. Abraham, I didn't expect you to be my kindred spirit. Goodbye. The two looked at each other and stood up at the same time. What would you like to order? Yarbemia walked over and asked with a smile. I'd like a braised chicken and rice, a sweet tofu pudding, and a stinky tofu, Abraham said, closing the menu. I'd like a young Jew fried rice, 10 beef kebabs, half spicy and half spicy. And a savory tofu pudding and a stinky tofu, Carla said without even opening the menu. Chris opened the menu and looked at the pictures of all kinds of food. Every one of them looked so tempting. She hesitated. Chapter 885. Isn't that too much? Chris hesitated. You should think about what I ordered before you ask, Carla said with a smile. Chris thought about the list of dishes Carla had just ordered and smiled. She closed the menu and looked at Mia. Then I'll order these 3. Okay, please wait a moment. Yarbemia nodded and walked to the next table. One order after another was placed in the kitchen. Meg began to get busy. Phyllis stood in the corner and watched with rapt attention. Meg's cooking ideas and cooking methods were completely different from hers. She was amazed by the variety of kitchen utensils he used. Watching him cook was like watching a show. The ingredients were rolling and jumping in the pot, the flames were raging in the pot, and all kinds of delicious smells filled the kitchen. It was almost suffocating. Dishes were brought out of the small kitchen and placed on the tables of the guests. Praises and compliments came from the bottom of the heart. Phyllis looked at Meg with admiration. Your young Jew fried rice, and your black pepper steak. Enjoy. Mia put the fried rice and steak in front of Carla and Chris, respectively, and walked to the next customer with a smile. The aroma of the red wine and the steak wafted into Chris's nose. There was also a hint of a special aroma. The alluring and special aroma made Chris's eyes light up. As the manager of a branch of Buffett Banks, Chris was no stranger to high-end restaurants. It was often easier to do business at the table. But even though she had eaten in all the high-end restaurants in Chaos City, she was still amazed by the aroma of this so-called black pepper steak. A whole piece of steak was placed on the plate. The steak had beautiful lines on it, and the thick sauce was drizzled over it. It was still emitting hot steam. Red and green peppers and vegetables were scattered around the steak. The exquisite presentation made the steak look even more tempting. Try it. You'll be surprised. Carla had already scooped up a spoonful of Yeongju fried rice and put it into her mouth with a happy smile. I have to wear formal attire for tonight's banquet. I can only eat a few mouthfuls, Chris said with a smile. She also picked up a knife and fork. The knife cut through the tender beef, red meat juice and red wine flowed out, and the aroma of red wine in the air became stronger. After the brown steak was cut, the center was pink. There was no blood, but a beautiful pink. She put it into her mouth with a fork. The beef was more tender than she had imagined. When she bit into it, the juices of the meat and red wine flowed out, and then mixed with the black pepper sauce in her mouth. It was like a magician's magic explosion in her mouth, and her calm taste buds were in ecstasy. After carefully chewing, Chris's expression changed in a split second. Apart from the delicious taste of the beef, the sweet taste of the wine was like a hidden treasure that suddenly appeared in front of her. It was an irresistible attack of sweetness. It was not overshadowed by the deliciousness of the beef and black pepper, nor did it appear to be abrupt or unique. Instead, it blended perfectly into the beef, making the beef even more delicious and mellow, giving it a mellow texture. The rich layers of flavor made her feel like she was constantly spinning in a delicious roulette. Every second was a wonderful and special experience. After swallowing, she felt as if a ball of warmth slid down her throat, warming her stomach. It was so comfortable that she wanted to moan. Chris's red lips opened slightly. In the end, she couldn't help but let out a soft moan. The mellow aroma of the red wine still lingered in her mouth, intoxicating her, but the taste buds on the tip of her tongue were already yearning for the next intimate contact. Chris opened her eyes, her face slightly red. She had never lost her composure in front of anyone before. It was just that the delicious taste of the black pepper steak was too impactful. Her body's natural reaction was beyond her control. However, her shyness was quickly overshadowed by her desire for good food. Chris had already cut off the second piece of steak and put it into her mouth. She closed her eyes and carefully tasted the delicious taste on the tip of her tongue. The mellow wine was better than the so-called countless treasures of the rich merchants. But why would someone use this kind of wine to cook? That owner was really an interesting person. As for what she said before about only having 2 bites, she had completely forgotten about it. How could she say something like that to such delicious food? Carla looked at Chris, who was eating one bite after another, and a satisfied smile appeared on her face. I told you, there are only 2 kinds of people at Mammoth, those who don't eat and those who finish their food. There's no such thing as 2 bites. Even the braised chicken and rice is so delicious. Mr. Mac never disappoints. Looks like we can't go back to Rodu. Abraham ate the braised chicken and rice in big mouthfuls, his face full of enjoyment. Ding! The knife and fork clanged on the plate. Chris looked at the completely empty plate in front of her and was slightly stunned. Then, she licked the sauce off the corner of her mouth, as if she hadn't had enough yet. Why did I finish it all? A strong sense of guilt welled up in Chris's heart. Looking at her slightly swollen belly, she almost couldn't resist the urge to eat more. No, I can't eat anymore. Chris shook her head and said with determination. This is just the beginning. Carla put down her spoon and said with a smile. Here's your savory tofu pudding. 2 servings of tofu pudding were placed in front of them. The refreshing aroma of tofu pudding drifted over, and Chris, who had already made up her mind, couldn't help but look down. The orange sauce was poured over the white tofu pudding, and the pickled mustard was chopped. Then, coriander, garlic, and chopped green onions were sprinkled on top. The hot tofu pudding was still mixed with the savory aroma. She was a little surprised. "What is this?" Carla smiled and said, "Didn't you say you didn't rest well these days, and that you have small pimples on your face? Eat this tofu pudding, and you'll be fine tomorrow." "Really?" Chris was a little surprised. Carla had mentioned the tofu pudding to her many times, and her skin had indeed improved a lot during this time. However, she didn't believe that it was because of a certain food. The branch hadn't reached its target this month, and because of anxiety and insomnia, there were a few pink pimples on her forehead and chin. Although they weren't very obvious, they were undoubtedly a disaster for a girl. She had tried many ways to get rid of them, but they still didn't go away. In her anxiety, they grew even more. Now, Carla said that the tofu pudding could cure all the pimples. She was pleasantly surprised, but also a little skeptical. "I brought you here to eat this today. Are you sure you don't want to try it?" Carla said with a serious face. Chapter 886. The tofu pudding slid down her tongue and melted. The light flavor of the tofu pudding and the savory sauce melted in her mouth. The few simple side dishes served as the finishing touch. Paired with the sweet and fragrant tofu pudding, the taste was so refreshing and delicious. After swallowing, the faint bean flavor lingered in the mouth for a long time. It was fragrant but not greasy. Chris's eyebrows relaxed, and a smile appeared on her face. She had just eaten a black pepper steak, and this savory tofu pudding was refreshing. Her whole body felt refreshed. Unlike the impactful steak, the tofu pudding was softer. It was like a steady stream, bringing unparalleled happiness. When Chris put down the spoon, the bowl was already empty. I only ate 2 mouthfuls. Why is it gone? This is so good." Chris looked at the empty bowl in front of her, a little upset. "How is it? Isn't it super good?" Carla asked with a smile. "Yes, it's the most delicious of all the delicacies you've brought me to." Chris nodded. It should be said that it was the most delicious of all the food she had ever eaten. "But I ate too much. I have to prepare a new dress later." Chris touched her belly helplessly. "It's okay. You won't be able to eat anything better than this at the banquet." Carla smiled slyly. "That's true." Chris paused for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "Your stinky tofu." At this time, Mia walked to the table with a large tray. She placed 4 covered plates in front of everyone. "Okay, here comes the highlight." Carla's eyes lit up. She rubbed her hands and looked at Chris. "You really don't want to try it? I think this is something you will regret if you miss it." Chris shook her head. "I have to meet an important client later. I can't eat anything too strong. Besides, if I eat more, I won't have any clothes to wear." "Okay, then I won't force you. But you better be prepared. This taste is a little too strong." Carla didn't force her. Instead, she warned her. Then Mia lifted the lids in front of everyone one by one. The thick stench was like 4 volcanoes erupting at the same time, instantly filling the entire space. "Oh!" Christy and the expectant Abraham jumped up from their chairs at almost the same time. Phyllis's face was flushed red, and she couldn't help but take 2 steps back. Only after the air had cleared did she catch her breath. She looked at the black stinky tofu on the table with lingering fear. It was a stench that she could not describe. It was so strong that she almost suffocated. However, the moment she left the area around the table, the stench disappeared completely. It was as if an invisible wall had trapped her within the area around the table. Thinking back, it did not make her feel disgusted. It was a little strange. But even so, Chris had no intention of sitting back down. The stench was real, and she couldn't accept it at all. She didn't want to smell it again for the rest of her life, let alone eat it. Carla. How did she manage to withstand the stench? And she looks like she's enjoying it. Chris looked strangely at Carla and Harrison, who were still sitting at the table. Not only did the two not react to the strong stench, but they also seemed to be enjoying it, as if they were enjoying something delicious. "No. Hold it." Abraham, who also stood up abruptly, resisted the urge to run away. He didn't expect the stench to be so strong. Although he was mentally prepared, he realized that he had underestimated it when he smelled it. However, when he saw Harrison and Carla sitting in their seats with a blissful expression on their faces, and Carla had already picked up a piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks and put it into her mouth with a blissful expression on her face, Abraham couldn't move his feet anymore. The stubbornness of a foodie made him stop in his tracks. He then calmed down and looked at the stinky tofu in front of him. The ink-black stinky tofu was neatly arranged on a long plate. The middle of the plate was filled with condiments, with bits of coriander and sticky brown sauce. It looked very tempting. The stench seemed to have softened a little at this moment. It was no longer pungent. Abraham seemed to have found a trace of fragrance in the thick stench, and it was slowly becoming clearer. It's so smelly that it's naturally fragrant. A look of astonishment appeared in Abraham's eyes. He sat down again and looked at the two people who were eating happily. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up his chopsticks, picked up a piece of stinky tofu, and put it into his mouth. After that, he chewed with all his might. Hot, hot, hot. Abraham's eyes widened. The crispy and fragrant skin was bitten open, and the boiling hot soup that was wrapped in the stinky tofu instantly burst in his mouth. It was as if a pot of hot soup had spilled in his mouth. At that moment, there was only one word in his mind: hot. However, the scalding sensation only lasted for an instant. The spicy soup began to blossom with its unparalleled deliciousness. The thought of spitting it out only appeared in Abraham's mind for an instant. He opened his mouth wide and breathed heavily. The temperature gradually dropped, and the deliciousness began to appear. The fragrant and crispy skin looked as if it had been fried, but the inside was only slightly harder than the tofu pudding. It was so fresh and refreshing, and the spices that were wrapped in it gave it a rich flavor and texture. The stench had completely disappeared, and only the rich aroma was surging from all directions. He now understood that it wasn't the extreme stench that made it fragrant, but the extreme aroma that made it stinky. Only those who had tasted it could peel off the layer of stench and experience the extreme aroma. The extreme reversal of the stench and the aroma, the perfect combination of crispness and tenderness, left an indelible taste in his mouth. To be able to eat such delicious food, I have no regrets in life. After swallowing a mouthful of stinky tofu, Abraham's throat moved, and he murmured to himself with a satisfied expression. The surrounding customers also unconsciously swallowed their saliva. For a moment, they couldn't figure out how the person who had just jumped up from the stench could enjoy the food so much in the blink of an eye, and even let out such an exaggerated sigh of having no regrets in life. The one who was most astonished was Christy. After all, she had smelled that intense stench with her very own eyes. She couldn't even stand there for a second longer, let alone eat it. She didn't think that someone of Abraham's status would be able to enjoy his meal so much. Chapter 887. Uncle, you don't have to look at it. It's mine. I ordered it a long time ago. Carla flashed a bright smile at Abraham and reached out for Chris's stinky tofu. Hold on. Abraham also pressed down on the plate in an urgent manner. Hey, Uncle, I know you're older than me, but you can't take advantage of your seniority. Let go of me, or I'll scream. Mammy Restaurant has its rules. Carla looked at Abraham with an unfriendly expression, and began to exert more force on his hand. Carla. Chris looked at the scene and couldn't help but feel anxious. Abraham's status was so high that it would be bad if Carla pissed him off. But seeing Carla's determined look, Carla didn't know how to persuade her. Hearing Carla's words, Abraham felt a little guilty. Before the dishes were served, he had carefully studied the rules written on the back of the menu. He knew better than anyone how stubborn Meg was. After all, he was the second person who dared to refuse the king's invitation and reward. The first one was Alex, who had resolutely refused the title of Northwest General that the king had given him. He had taken his sword and traveled the continent, leaving only a nominal position. Therefore, he followed the rules written on the menu. He was afraid that his name would be blacklisted by Meg. That would be a great loss for him. Robbing other people's food was worse than anything written on the menu. Abraham was all smiles as he said, "Little girl. Little girl, don't be in such a hurry. How could I snatch your vegetables in broad daylight? I just have something to discuss with you. I'm not snatching. However, he had no intention of loosening his grip at all. You want to buy it? Carla frowned and shook her head. I won't sell it even if you pay 10 times the price. Abraham turned his gaze to Chris and said with a smile, I don't want to buy it from you. I want to make a deal with this young lady. Is this stinky tofu hers? So the decision is in her hands, right? Little girl, don't worry. Let's see what your friend says first. Me. Chris was surprised that Duke Abraham would talk to Carla so calmly over a bowl of stinky tofu. She didn't expect that Duke Abraham would leave the decision in her hands. Yes. Abraham nodded and glanced at the badge on Chris's chest. He smiled and said, I think you're an employee of Buffett Banks, right? I have a large sum of money in Rodu, and it has been piling up in the storeroom since 20 or 30 years ago. I should have quite a lot of money by now. If you agree to give this stinky tofu to me, I will deposit the money in Buffett Banks, and you will be the beneficiary. Chris's mouth was slightly agape as she looked at Abraham in disbelief. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. In the Buffett Bank system, there had always been a list of the most worthy people in the world. Apart from the dragons who used gold and silver as their mattresses, it was impossible for them to deposit money in the Buffett Bank system. Duke Abraham was ranked 10th on the list. There were 10 dukes in the Roth Empire. Except for Abraham, all of them had vast lands and endless wealth. Abraham didn't have any land, but he had an unknown amount of wealth. Apart from the huge inheritance left to him by the late king, he hadn't received any land in the past few years. Instead, he had received countless rewards from the king, as well as a series of properties under his name. No one knew how much money he had, but everyone knew he had a lot of money, the kind that was piled up in the storeroom. Countless marketing bigwigs from Buffett Banks had gone to Rodu to see Abraham, but he was either eating delicious food or on his way to eat delicious food. None of them had succeeded in pulling his money into the bank. But now, for a bowl of stinky tofu, Abraham had agreed to deposit his money in Buffett Banks, and he had even promised to put her name as the beneficiary. Even someone like Chris, who had done a lot of big deals, still felt a little dazed when she was suddenly hit by such a big piece of cake. Are you serious? She asked hesitantly. Carla looked at Chris in surprise. She had known Chris for more than a year, and this was the first time she had seen her lose her composure like this. And as the manager of a branch of Buffett Banks in Chaos City, she hadn't changed her expression at all when she first met her father. Who is he? Carla looked at Abraham again. Someone who could make Chris lose her composure must be richer than her father, and a lot richer. Yes, I'm a man of my word. I only want this stinky tofu. Abraham nodded, looking at the stinky tofu in their hands. Not only would this promise allow Chris to exceed this year's target, but she would also be able to get another promotion as she had just been promoted to a branch manager. However, Chris glanced at Carla, and then looked at Abraham with regret. I've already promised to give this stinky tofu to Carla. I'm sorry, sir. If you can accept half of the stinky tofu and keep your promise, I can reluctantly give you half of the stinky tofu, Carla said, smiling at Abraham. Half? A hint of hesitation appeared on Abraham's face. Carla shrugged. If you don't make a decision now, the stinky tofu will get cold, and you won't be able to enjoy the taste of the juicy liquid. Deal. Abraham nodded without hesitation. Chris was pleasantly surprised. She looked at Carla gratefully. Carla winked at her, and her heart warmed. Carla and Abraham began to move the stinky tofu to their plates from both sides until there was only one piece left. They looked at each other, and the atmosphere was a little tense. Sir, I'm a little girl. Why don't you give me the stinky tofu since I'm so cute? Carla pouted. I'm cute too. Why don't you give me the stinky tofu? Abraham blinked his eyes like crazy. Carla was speechless. They are indeed evenly matched. Carla sighed in her heart. Looks like there's nothing more to say. Let's split it 50-50. Carla put away her expression and looked at Abraham coldly. Okay, I'll do it. Abraham asked for a steak knife from Yabemia and began to cut the stinky tofu with a serious expression. Carla also came forward and looked at it with a serious face, afraid that she would eat too little. The steak knife cut into the stinky tofu, and the juices slowly flowed out. Ah! Chapter 888. The division of the stinky tofu had attracted a lot of attention. The way the two of them discussed the ownership of a piece of coriander had refreshed many people's understanding of the situation. However, the two of them didn't take it for granted. For a foodie, even a piece of coriander wouldn't be a problem. Chris's understanding of the situation had indeed been shaken, but her patience was as good as her mood. Now that she had Abraham's promise, she didn't have to worry about whether or not she could persuade the notorious businessman. All she needed to do was to get Abraham's written promise. Also, this case would definitely become a classic in the history of Buffett banks. A huge deposit receipt from a portion of stinky tofu. After finishing half of the stinky tofu, Abraham still wanted more, but he looked at the kitchen and got up to pay the bill. He also paid the bill for Chris and Carla. "Thank you for your hospitality, Duke Abraham. My name is Christy." Christy bowed respectfully to Abraham as they exited the dining hall. "Duke Abraham?" Carla's expression changed. She swallowed her saliva and hurriedly bowed to Abraham. She stuck out her tongue and said, "I didn't know you were a duke. I hope you don't blame me for offending you." "Haha, little girl, I admire your attitude towards food. How could I blame you for it?" Abraham waved his hand dismissively, then looked at Chris and said with a smile, "Miss Chris should have recognized me long ago, right?" Christy nodded, and said, "Yes. In Chaos City, the only person who can wear Pharos Emerald Ring is you, Duke Felipe. Chris, you're amazing. You can guess who he is with just a ring." Carla looked at Chris with admiration. Abraham nodded. He looked at Chris. "I'm in Chaos City, but my money is in Rodu. I need someone to send a letter back. How much do you want me to deposit?" Christy opened her mouth. This was the first time she had encountered a situation like this. No one knew how much money Duke Abraham had, but for a bank, the more the better. However, she didn't know how much she should say. "All right, I roughly understand. I'll get them to open a money vault." Abraham nodded and waved to the servant waiting at the door. He asked the servant to take out a pen and paper and scribbled a line of words on it. Finally, he put the pen down and wrote his name on it before handing it to Chris. "Thank you, Duke Abraham." Chris took the piece of paper with both hands and said in a somewhat emotional voice, "You're welcome. If you come to Mammoth often, we might even become friends," Abraham said with a smile as he walked towards the carriage. "How much money is in a vault?" Carla asked curiously as she looked at the paper in Chris's hand. "I don't know either, but it should be a lot of money." Chris blew at the ink on the paper. After making sure it was dry, she carefully put it away. Then she opened her arms and hugged Carla happily. "Thank you, Carla. You don't have to be so polite with me." Carla pursed her lips and then smiled. "But since you've accepted such a big order, you don't have to meet that legendary pervert tonight, right? I heard from my father that he's not a good person." "No, I still have to attend the banquet tonight. It's my job. But with Duke Abraham's promise, I don't have to worry about anything. I won't let that pervert take advantage of me," Chris said with a smile. "All right. You won't let those stinky men take advantage of you anyway." Carla nodded and said with some regret, "I wanted to take you to see Suede's clothes. I heard that new clothes were released today. I was so angry that I didn't get that dress last time. Their clothes are so beautiful and super special. I have never seen them in a style that I have never seen before. Suede. I seem to have heard a lot about this shop from the rich ladies recently. Is it famous? I heard that a dress sold for 100,000 copper coins." The fight between Abraham and Carla over the stinky tofu made many customers who weren't interested in stinky tofu want to try it. It caused a small wave of orders. 100 stinky tofu were sold out quickly. Naturally, some customers who had tried it yesterday complained. Meg didn't hear their complaints. The restaurant's capacity determined the supply. Seeing the customers go from dislike to love, Meg felt a sense of accomplishment. Of course, he also felt a sense of satisfaction. Near the kitchen sat 4 big men in soft armor. They had long swords hanging from their waists and large glasses of beer in their hands. They were talking in a low voice. "Have you heard? A few mercenary groups disappeared while on a mission recently. Their bodies were found later. It's said that they weren't attacked by monsters. They were killed. Why haven't I heard? The news has been spreading like wildfire. It's the first time that so many mercenary groups have been wiped out. Many weak mercenary groups don't dare to go on missions anymore. Furthermore, I've also heard that these mercenary groups all have a unique characteristic, which is that there is at least one elf among their members." Mag, who was stir-frying, suddenly slowed down as he listened intently. "Sure. It's not confirmed yet. Be careful not to be targeted by the Grey Temple for spreading rumors." Everyone's voices became much quieter. "Do you think the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple didn't do anything about it?" "Of course. They just haven't announced it yet. The Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle are more concerned than anyone else. It's just that it's not easy to catch the culprit in a short time." Mag's brows furrowed as he listened to everyone's conversation. It appeared that those bastards had most likely already extended their reach into Chaos City, and not only were they targeting the elves who were seeking refuge in Chaos City, they were also targeting the elves who were out on missions. The mercenaries didn't talk about this for long. Soon, they moved on to other things. Meg put the fried rice in the pot on a plate and handed it to MIA. "These guys really deserve to die. Looks like I'll have to go hunting tomorrow." Chapter 889. Although the Marquis family wasn't as powerful as the Buffett family and the family Morton, they were still one of the founding families of the Aden Chamber of Commerce, and one of their daughters had married Earl Boris of the Roth Empire as a concubine, so they still enjoyed a high status in Chaos City. Today's banquet was being held at the Marquis Manor, and the guests were all well-known figures in Chaos City's business world. They were either rich or respectable. Furthermore, it was said that a mysterious VIP would be attending, which also piqued many people's curiosity. Someone who could be treated as a VIP by the Marquis family must be of high status. At such a banquet, there were naturally many beauties. Apart from their families, there were also many beauties who came with all kinds of motives. They were all holding wine glasses and looking for their targets with smiles. "Didn't you say that Miss Christie from Buffett Banks was coming to see me today? Where is she?" A fat middle-aged man was sitting, scanning the crowd with an unhappy expression as he spoke to a servant beside him. That servant respectfully said, "Master, she made an appointment with you 3 days ago. I asked her to come to see you at the banquet as you instructed. If she wanted to get some money from you, she should have gotten it by now." Bart sneered, "Heh, bitch, she even dares to stand me up. If she comes today, I'll definitely teach her a lesson. If she dares not to come, I'll see where else she can get money from today onwards." Christie, who was wearing an aqua blue dress, had actually arrived a long time ago. She was standing in the shadows with a glass of white wine in her hand, carefully sizing up Bart's back. Bart Kelt was the boss of the largest horse caravan in Chaos City. Apart from the major families who had their own horse caravans and some individual businessmen who did their own transportation, nearly 1/3 of Chaos City's goods were transported by his horse caravan. Just this alone was enough to make him one of the top nobles in Chaos City. However, Bart had only made his fortune in the past 20 to 30 years. Compared to the other major families, he was still lacking. Compared to the giants like the family Morton and the Buffett family, there was still a big gap between them. However, the horse caravan was a business that required payment in advance. There was basically no loss in business, so Bart had a huge amount of cash in his hands. This was something that others couldn't compare to. Buffett Banks was naturally the most sensitive to this. However, in the internal documents of Buffett Banks, as a local tycoon in Chaos City who had a huge amount of cash, Bart's recommendation index was at the bottom. His rating was, "Not recommended for female salespeople to be alone." The reason was very simple. Bart was a complete pervert and pervert. He used his huge savings as bait and had already made a move on the staff of Buffett Bank several times. After that, he used various excuses to not fulfill his previous promises. He was basically blacklisted. Chris was naturally aware of this. If it wasn't for the fact that it was almost the end of the month and their branch still hadn't reached the 30 million deposit target, she wouldn't have targeted him. She had encountered this kind of guy before, but she had cleverly resolved it several times. She wasn't like those girls who foolishly threw away their chastity and failed to get what they wanted in the end. But now that she had Duke Abraham's letter of deposit, even though it wasn't his entire fortune, it should be no less than 30 million copper coins. Now that she had a better idea, she had more room to maneuver when dealing with a wily old fox like Bart. Compared to the target, she cared more about herself. She had always hated this kind of guy who used both hard and soft tactics to get the girls in charge of soliciting money. Bart looked at those rich businessmen who had gathered together and were talking and laughing. He finished the wine in his glass in one gulp. These old things had their eyes on their foreheads. They looked down on him, the boss of the horse caravan. Although they didn't say it out loud, they were always badmouthing him behind his back. His horse caravan had been growing bigger and bigger in recent years. The negotiations to buy the second largest horse caravan in Chaos City were almost completed. As long as he bought that horse caravan, he would have control of 50% of Chaos City's logistics. It wouldn't be long before even Ian and Jeffrey would have to look at him on the same level. And those guys, when the time comes, they should be surrounding me and trying to please me, right? Bart laughed mockingly. As for why he came here today, other than wanting to trick the little beauty he saw before into his bed, the more important reason was to meet the mysterious VIP. He had heard some news. Although it hadn't been confirmed yet, it was enough for him to make a special trip here. Christy observed from the side for a long while. She handed the wine glass to a waiter, tidied her dress, took a deep breath, and walked over to Bart. Christy walked over to Bart with a polite smile, and said, "Mr. Bart, I'm Christy from Buffett Banks. Nice to meet you." Bart held his wine glass and raised his eyes to look at Chris. His eyes lit up slightly, revealing a trace of desire. The beautiful Chris was wearing an aqua blue off-shoulder dress, revealing her delicate collarbone and a faintly discernible cleavage. Her light blonde, slightly wavy hair was draped over her shoulders, and the pair of white, slender legs that were exposed under her dress made him unable to shift his gaze away. Gorgeous little beauty. The corners of Bart's mouth curled up slightly, but his face suddenly became a little gloomy. He sneered at Christy, and said, "You said you wanted to see me, but made me wait here for so long. Do you know how precious my time is? I'm sorry, Mr. Bart. I was delayed by work, and there are still 10 minutes to the time we agreed on. I didn't expect you to come so early." Christy still had a professional smile on her face. She didn't show any self-blame or fear at all. "The time we agreed on?" Bart laughed disdainfully. He looked at Christy, and said, "When I arrive is the time we agreed on. Shouldn't you be waiting here in advance? Besides, is there anything more important than me?" A hint of disgust flashed across Christy's eyes, but she didn't show it on her face. Bart was indeed more annoying than the rumors said. Chapter 890. The amount of wine in the crystal glass wasn't much, but if a girl drank 8 glasses at once, it was still a lot. The waiter opened his mouth to say something, but after taking a look at Bart, he shut his mouth obediently. This wasn't a place for him to interrupt. Chris glanced at the wine glass. The smile on her face had already disappeared. She shook her head slightly and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Bart. Please forgive me for not being able to drink these 8 glasses of wine. I made an appointment with you today to discuss the matter of your deposit. The high interest rate of Buffett Banks can bring you rich returns. This is a mutually beneficial business." Scumbag indeed. Chris's heart was filled with disgust. Even someone as experienced as her knew how to protect herself. If it was a little girl with no experience, she would probably have drunk 8 cups of wine due to the other party's identity. If her alcohol tolerance was slightly lower, she would be at the mercy of Bart's mercy. Not drinking? Bart's eyes flashed viciously. He slammed the glass on the table and looked at Chris unkindly. It's not your first day at work. You don't know who I am, do you? How dare you talk to me like this? Aren't you afraid that I'll tell your boss and make you lose your job forever? The commotion attracted the attention of some people in the surroundings. Everyone looked at Bart and Chris with some surprise. They didn't know how this beautiful girl had provoked the mad dog Bart. Bart moved closer to Christy and said in a low voice, "No one can avoid my carriage when doing business in Chaos City, unless they just want to take a look around Chaos City. My word is more effective than the city lords. You have to drink today, or I'll make sure you can't get a single order in Chaos City." Chris clenched her fists under her skirt. She looked at the domineering Bart and pursed her lips. In the eyes of these guys, they were just playthings that could be toyed with as they pleased, because these guys held their lives in their hands. Although she was already the manager of a branch of Buffett Banks, in the eyes of these guys, there was no difference. Looking at the wine glass, a trace of hesitation and struggle appeared on Chris's face. She hated this kind of deal, but she had spent 5 years to climb to this position. She was unwilling to be wiped out like this. The waiter holding the glass looked at Chris pitifully. He had seen this kind of thing many times, but most of those beautiful women threw themselves at the men. The smile on Bart's face was also somewhat proud. What kind of woman hadn't he seen before? As long as it was something he wanted, he always had a way to make them submit. The more unyielding a woman was, the more interesting and refreshing the process would be. Just like this woman now, she was already starting to make him a little excited. "Miss Chris, I didn't expect to see you here again." At this moment, a surprised voice sounded from the side, and a figure slowly walked over. Chris, who was hesitating to reach for the glass, was slightly taken aback. She turned her head and saw the person walking over slowly. It was Abraham, whom she had met at Amy's tonight. Her face lit up. He was about to succeed, but he was interrupted. Bart looked at Abraham with some displeasure. Abraham's clothes and appearance were quite ordinary, and he didn't have any impression of him. He didn't seem like a famous mission. Bart suddenly stood up with a gloomy face. He looked at Abraham and said in a deep voice, "Who are you? Can't you see I'm talking to her? Who am I?" Abraham stopped, slightly taken aback. Bart saw that he was scared stiff, and was even more certain that he was just a guy who had forced his way into the banquet. His face grew colder, and he was about to say something. Bowen, the head of the Marquis family, who had been surrounded by the crowd, hurried over with a group of people. He walked past Bart, and stopped in front of Abraham. He looked at Abraham respectfully and guiltily, and said, "Duke Abraham, why are you here so early? I should have received you at the door." Everyone in the banquet hall turned their attention to Duke Abraham upon hearing this, and they all gathered around him to extend respectful salutes. Many of them had come here specifically to greet Duke Abraham. Duke Abraham. Bart's face changed in an instant. Looking at Abraham, who had an ordinary appearance and didn't have any outstanding clothes, his heart was in a mess. His main purpose for coming today was to get close to Duke Abraham and expand his transportation channels in the Roth Empire. He had thought that Bowen would definitely welcome such an important guest with great fanfare, so he didn't think about it at all. He didn't expect that he would bump into him, and act so arrogantly. Bart felt uneasy. He could only hope that Abraham didn't take it to heart. Fortunately, his tone was not very friendly, and he didn't say anything inappropriate. "I had an early dinner tonight, and then had a pleasant business talk with Miss Christie. I came here earlier than expected." Abraham nodded with a smile. Everyone's gazes landed on Christie. They were curious about what kind of business this beautiful young lady had discussed with Duke Abraham. If the Duke used the word pleasant, this young lady was destined to be extraordinary. Some people recognized Christie, and were surprised that this competent manager of Buffett Banks was able to take down Abraham, who had just arrived at Chaos City not long ago. Of course, more people began to think about how to make use of this young lady to get closer to the Duke. Could it be? Bart thought of what Christie had said. Could it be that she was late because she had a business talk with Duke Abraham? And he had made things difficult for her just now. With that thought, Bart's face darkened even more. I see. Then this Miss Christie is really something. She even got the Duke's first business deal in Chaos City, Bowen said with a smile as he looked at Christie. Bowen looked at Chris and said with a smile. Everyone laughed in agreement and looked at Chris with eyes full of admiration. Christie smiled modestly, and then found a chance to bow to Abraham. She respectfully said, Duke Abraham, I didn't expect you to attend this banquet. Chapter 891. Bart's expression changed slightly, but he quickly regained his composure and said with a bashful smile, Your Excellency Duke, Miss Chris and I are also discussing business. It's just that we had a small disagreement before. I didn't expect that Your Excellency Duke had already cooperated with Miss Chris. Seeing Miss Chris's ability and credibility, I naturally have no problems. I've decided to cooperate with Miss Chris and deposit 50 million copper coins into Buffett banks. Chris glanced at Bart, her eyes full of disgust. Bart was really disgusting. The 50 million coppers wasn't because he recognized her ability, but because he wanted to please Duke Abraham. But as a branch manager, she couldn't refuse such a big customer, and she couldn't bear the consequences of refusing Celt Carriage Company's cooperation. Bart glanced at Chris from the corner of his eyes, the corner of his mouth slightly raised. He was well aware of the rules of this circle, so he was able to have everyone under his control. From a coachman to controlling half of the logistics of Chaos City, he knew better than anyone else how to deal with people below him. No one could refuse the olive branch extended by Celt Carriage and Horse Company, because everyone knew whose era it was. Abraham stared at Bart. He did not like to deal with businessmen, because they often wore many layers of masks compared to ordinary people. It was difficult to see their faces under the masks. It was also difficult to find a like-minded person among them. Busy people like them did not have the time to look for delicious food. They were not as interesting as the little girl named Carlos. If it weren't for Bowen's kind invitation, he wouldn't have come to this banquet since they could be considered relatives. However, how could he not see that the situation wasn't as Bart had described? It was just that Chris didn't say anything, which meant that she had tacitly agreed with Bart's words. The 50 million deposit should be very important to her, otherwise, she wouldn't have specially come to this banquet. Therefore, he didn't intend to say anything more. We, the Buffett banks, refuse to accept these 50 million copper coins. Furthermore, from today onwards, the Buffett banks will terminate all cooperation with the Celt Carriage Company. At this moment, a voice rang out from behind the crowd. Everyone turned around in surprise and their eyes lit up when they saw a figure in a bright red ceremonial robe slowly walking towards them from the hill. Many people found this gown to be rather familiar. It was most likely the same gown as the one that Gloria had worn during the Chamber of Commerce's mid-year banquet. However, the bright red color gave off a completely different vibe on she. There was a hint of seduction in her cold demeanor, and she was like an enchanting queen that no one could look away from. Of course, the most surprising thing was that Mr. Hill, the head of the Buffett family, had directly rejected Bart. It had to be pointed out that Celt Carriage Company was one of the upstarts in Chaos City. They controlled half of the logistics industry in Chaos City, and had a lot of say in it. Miss Hill. Chris's eyes suddenly lit up. She turned around and looked at the queen-like figure slowly walking towards her on the hill. She couldn't help but feel excited. If there was anyone in Buffett banks who had the right to reject Bart Buffett, it could only be Miss Hill, except for Mr. Buffett, who no longer managed the company's affairs. However, like everyone else, Chris also didn't expect Miss Hill to reject Bart. She even directly cut off all business with Celt Carriage and Horse Company. This was a cooperation that every branch manager had racked their brains to achieve. Miss Hill, what did you just say? Bart frowned, slightly taken aback by Miss Hill's words. Miss Hill stood in front of Bart. She looked at him calmly and said, Mr. Bart, I said that from today onwards, Buffett banks will stop all business with Celt Carriage and you. Do you understand now? Bart's face suddenly darkened. He looked at Miss Hill and said in a low voice, Do you know how big Celt Carriage and Horse Company is now? When I complete the acquisition of Bray Horse Company, more than 50% of Chaos City's logistics will be in my hands. Are you sure Buffett Banks wants to cut off all business with Celt Carriage and Horse Company? The banquet hall gradually quieted down. Everyone looked at Miss Hill and Bart. One was the head of the biggest conglomerate on the Norland continent, while the other was a rising magnate who was gradually climbing to the top of Chaos City's business circle. It wasn't common for them to be at loggerheads. Miss Hill smiled contemptuously and said, Buffett Banks controls 70% of the long-distance currency circulation on the Norland continent. The annual cash flow through them is 10,000 times the total assets of Celt Carriage and Horse Company. The safety and efficiency of their own carriage and horse company are far better than Celt Carriage and Horse Company. So, how big do you think Celt Carriage and Horse Company is? Bart looked at Miss Hill. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The veins on his forehead were faintly throbbing. 10,000 times was enough to make any words pale in comparison. Even if he ran fast enough, in front of a colossus like the Buffett Bank, he was still just an ant that could run faster. Everyone in the banquet hall had different expressions. Although everyone knew Buffett Banks was huge, few knew exactly how big it was. However, when Miss Hill said 10,000 times, everyone clearly realized how terrifying it was. Buffett Banks wasn't just a bank in Chaos City, but a bank in the entire Norland continent. Celt Carriage and Horse Company was doing well, but it was far from being comparable to Buffett Banks. An 18-year-old girl who was born with a silver spoon in her mouth and had never suffered a bit dared to talk to him like that. Bart's heart was burning with anger. He looked at Miss Hill and said, Buffett Banks has the right to be proud, but if you shut out your business partners without any reason and speak ill of them, I'd like to know how long you can continue to be so glorious. Buffett Banks has always been known for its excellent service. We welcome money with a smile on our face. Miss Hill's expression gradually turned cold. She looked at Bart and said coldly, Why are you only picking on you? Are you pretending to be ignorant? Do you need me to expose the dirty things you've done? Bart's expression changed. In the end, he clenched his fists and swallowed his anger. Chapter 892. In the past, the most troublesome thing for merchants was the huge amount of money they had to carry with them. They would often encounter fierce bandits and lose both their money and their lives. Later, Buffett Banks appeared, and its branches spread all over the Norland continent. It created an original deposit receipt and withdrawal system, which turned conspicuous money into a deposit receipt. If it was an experienced customer, they didn't even need a deposit receipt. Their deposit information was quickly updated, and they could withdraw the money directly from other places with the saved information. This completely solved the problem of security for the merchants. Although they had to pay a certain handling fee, this fee was not on the same level as the high cost of hiring powerful sorcerers and knights to escort them. Besides, there was almost no risk, so it was very popular among the merchants. Therefore, in just a few decades, a financial empire that covered the entire Norland continent and even had branches on Dragon Island emerged. Because there was no money to rob, and it was difficult to find a way to sell goods, the bandits on the major trade routes gradually disappeared. It was as if Buffett Banks had wiped out an industry. It had to be admitted that Buffett Banks had penetrated into every corner of the Norland continent. After launching the Personal Savings and Loans program, it was closely related to the ordinary people. It would be an immeasurable loss for any company if they were rejected by such a giant. Therefore, the warning from Mr. Hill was very important. At least, no one present dared to ignore it. Buffett's example was still in front of them. Even a giant like Celt Carriage Company was rejected. No one would want to try. The girls from Buffett Banks were all very good-looking. However, from today onwards, no big boss would dare to have any ideas about them. Christie looked at Mr. Hill with red eyes. She couldn't control her emotions. A huge deposit of 50 million and a partnership with a giant in the logistics industry was rejected by Mr. Hill just to tell the world one thing: don't touch the girls from Buffett Banks. Abraham appraised the Hill with a hint of approval in his eyes. This rising star of the business world had left a deep impression on him. He had met her a few times during the royal banquet in Rodu. The last time he had seen her, she was only a 14-year-old little girl. 4 to 5 years had passed since then, and she had already become the leader of the Buffett family. Looking at Bart again, Abraham frowned. He had always despised this kind of person. Moreover, Chris could be considered an acquaintance of his. It made him feel even more uncomfortable that something like this happened to her. Bart saw the change in Abraham's expression, and his gloomy mood sunk to the bottom. It seems that today's wish will not come true. He looked at Chris again, and his eyes were full of hatred. Today, because of this woman, he went for wool and came home shorn. He would only be a joke if he stayed here. He immediately cupped his hands to Abraham and said, "Lord Duke, I suddenly feel a little unwell. I need to go back and see a doctor. I will take my leave first." Abraham nodded slightly. This was Chaos City, after all, so he couldn't really say anything. Besides, it would be very difficult for him to say anything better than what the hill had said. Bart turned and left. His pace was a little quick, like a panicked dog. The hill didn't look at Bart again. She turned to Abraham with a smile, and said, "Duke Abraham, long time no see. I heard that you have been eating at Mammoth's recently. It seems that you are very satisfied with Mr. Mac's cooking." Miss Hill, you also like to eat at Mammoth's? Mr. Mac's cooking is without a doubt. I came to Chaos City especially for him. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be able to take a step out of Rodu in the past few decades. Abraham looked at the hill with surprise. The hill nodded with a smile, and said, "Everyone in Chaos City knows about Mr. Mac's cooking. It's just that if you want to eat at Mammoth's now, you have to line up a lot earlier than usual. I can only go there when I'm free. Mr. Mac won't save a seat for me." Abraham's interest was piqued by the hill, and he began to chat with the hill. "Even I have to line up at the entrance every day, let alone you. However, Mr. Mac is a diligent cook, so it's quite interesting to line up outside. It's worth it. After all, I'm also a free man." The wealthy businessman of Chaos City stood awkwardly off to the side. They were all amazed by the way the hill cut into the conversation. At the same time, they also committed the name Mammoth to memory. Duke Abraham had always been a mysterious man, but he had come all the way from Rodu to Chaos City for a restaurant. Furthermore, it seemed that he didn't like to listen to romance. If they didn't learn more about Mammoth, they wouldn't even be able to bring up the topic. Mammoth is such a wonderful place. It's also my lucky day. A smile appeared on Christie's face as she looked at she and Abraham chatting happily. If it weren't for the fact that she had met Duke Abraham at Mammy Restaurant, she wouldn't have known how the night would have ended. Then, she couldn't help but think of the man who had placed his big hand on the little girl's head. That gentle smile and words, she silently thought in her heart, that boss. What kind of ability does he have to make so many people fall in love with his delicacies? The next time I go, I must properly try that stinky tofu. You're Christie, right? Christie was lost in thought when the hill appeared in front of her. Yes. Christie faltered for a moment, then hurriedly bowed to the hill. She looked at the hill with respect and gratitude, and said, "Yes, Miss Hill. I am Christie." A smile appeared on the hill's face. She extended her hand to Christie, and said, "Congratulations. You've done what countless predecessors of Buffett banks have failed to do for decades. You've received your first deposit from Duke Abraham." Christie hurriedly reached out and shook the hill's hand. Her face blushed slightly, and she said, "It was just a coincidence. If it weren't for Mammoth, I don't think I would have been so lucky. Luck is also a part of strength. Duke Abraham just told me how you did it. You relied on your strength, not just luck. Of course, Mammoth is indeed a good place." The hill nodded with a smile. Then, she looked at Christie, and said, "If I remember correctly, you've only been promoted to manager of the third branch for less than 3 months, right?" "Yes." Christie nodded. "Then stay for a full year. It's a very good position. You can learn a lot. I stayed in this position for 10 years. The hill nodded, and said, "By the way, what do you think of the rule? If a salesperson in a branch is violated due to business relations, the branch's management will all be dismissed." Christy froze for a moment, and then a surprised smile appeared on her face. She hurriedly nodded, and said, "I think it should be very good." Chapter 893. At the end of the banquet, the guests left one after another. Hill got into the carriage. A pale golden luminous pearl shone softly in the carriage. She looked at the middle-aged man sitting opposite her and said, "Raise the price of Black Horse by 30%. The man looked at Hill and said, "Miss, the negotiations between Black Horse and Celt are almost over. I'm afraid they won't be able to accept such a sudden increase. As long as the contract hasn't been signed, any changes are normal business behavior. If they can't accept it, that's their business." The corners of Hill's mouth rose slightly. "Besides, they will accept the offer." The man hesitated. "But, Miss, Black Horse has brought rich returns to the bank over the years. It's a high-quality asset. If you suddenly sell it, there will be some doubts from the consortium. Are you sure you don't want to reconsider? Those old guys don't even have the right to vote. If they want to question it, let them. Do you want me to explain it to them?" Hill smiled and lifted a corner of the carriage curtain to look at the passing street outside. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly as he said, "It looks like a promising future, but who knows that it will soon become a sunset industry. If we don't get rid of it now, we won't be able to get rid of it later." The man opened his mouth, but swallowed his questions when he looked at Hill's profile. He nodded and said, "Yes." Then he opened the folder and wrote 2 lines. As Hill had said, Hill had 100% of the voting rights of the Buffett Consortium. She didn't need to explain any of her decisions to anyone, and no one could interfere, including old Buffett. No one could understand why Ian would hand over such a massive amount of power to Hill without any restrictions. However, Buffett continued to grow at a rapid pace during the 3 years that Hill had been in charge of it, and all of the voices of doubt had disappeared. No one could surpass him in terms of foresight, strong execution ability, and accurate grasp of the wind. "I won't accept 50 million, but I'll take 50 million more from you. Then I'll dig a hole and bury you more thoroughly." The corner of Hill's mouth curled up into a sneer. He reached out and took a financial report from the bookshelf at the side. The carriage was moving so fast that it didn't shake at all. "Damn bitch. I'm going to deal with all of you sooner or later. Let's see if you still dare to talk to me like this when I have complete control over Chaos City's logistics system." In a magnificent room, Bart flipped over a cabinet that was filled with all kinds of exquisite collectibles. Porcelain and jade objects fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. The servants stood trembling in the corner, not daring to speak. Bart smashed a few more things before his anger subsided a little. Old master. Bad news." At this time, a figure dressed like an accountant hurried in. Seeing the things on the ground, his expression changed slightly, but he still walked forward quickly. "What's wrong?" Bart frowned. He had a bad premonition and raised his hand to signal the servants to leave. The accountant said anxiously, "Just now, the Black Horse team suddenly raised their offer by 30%, and their tone was very tough. They only gave us 1 day to consider, and they want all the transactions in cash. There is no room for negotiation." "What?" Bart's expression also changed. His thick eyebrows stood up, and he said angrily, "Didn't we have an agreement before? Why did they suddenly change their mind?" The man shook his head with a sullen expression. I don't know. The acquisition team is in a complete mess now. I don't know what to do. Old master, do you think we should continue with the acquisition?" Bart was silent for a while with a gloomy expression. Finally, he gritted his teeth and said, "Sign." The man hesitated. "But, master, we're a little tight on cash right now. During this time, we've been constantly expanding and purchasing. 150 million copper coins are already a little difficult. If we add another 50 million, I'm afraid we can only borrow from Buffett banks." The veins on Bart's forehead throbbed. He was also clear about the cash flow problem. Celt's expansion speed was too fast. Although it looked fierce, the cash flow in their hands was actually very tight. He had met Christie this time to take advantage of her, and in fact had the intention of formally contacting Buffett Banks. But he hadn't expected that the Hill would directly cut off all opportunities for cooperation. I will take care of the money problem. Bly has to be bought. This is the most important part of Kelt's expansion. After buying Bart, Kelt will have no opponents in Chaos City. Tell them to finalize the contract as soon as possible. I will bring the remaining 50 million before tomorrow night, Bart said in a low voice. Yes, I will go right away. The man hurried off again. Bastard. Bart kicked over the big vase next to him and strode out of the door. Amy, can you go play with Jessica tomorrow? Father has to go out to gather materials for a day. Because the journey is a little long and dangerous, I can't bring Amy along, Meg said with a smile as he stood beside the bed and looked at Amy, who was lying on the little bed. Tilda Amy shook her head and sat up. She looked at Meg with a serious expression, and said, Father, if there is any danger, you must bring Amy along. Little M, I just learned a super powerful spell from Master Urian. As long as you take me with you, I'll be able to protect Father. Also, I only have 1 day off a week. I want to be with Father, Amy said coquettishly as she pouted her little mouth and blinked her big blue eyes at Meg. Meg felt as if his heart was about to melt. He didn't know what to say when he saw Amy's pitiful look. Meg thought for a while, and decided to change his plan. He stroked Amy's head with a smile, and said, All right, I will bring you along. When we come back, Father will make roast duck for you. Amy turned to look at Ugly Duckling, who was sleeping soundly while hugging her leg, and said hesitantly, Father, Ugly Duckling is still young. Why don't we do it later? All right, let's find other ducks. Meg looked at Ugly Duckling pitifully, and nodded with a smile. The late autumn night was cold and lonely. Chapter 894. The news of the mercenary groups being wiped out had spread throughout the Chaos Guild. In just a few days, the same thing had happened more than a dozen times, and none of them had survived. Furthermore, not only were they weak mercenary groups, but a group with a 7th-tier magic caster had also been wiped out. The guild hadn't released the results of the investigation yet, but this morning, they released an announcement. All mercenaries, please be careful. Mercenary groups with elves in their group are advised to suspend their missions until the Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle find out the details. This announcement undoubtedly caused quite a stir. It confirmed the rumors that had been spread before. Although they didn't know who the culprits were, one thing was for sure, they were targeting the elves in the mercenary groups. The City Lord's castle's announcement about accepting wandering elves and Alex's warning added a layer of haze to the mercenary groups with elves in their group. Some even panicked. Elves were excellent archers and natural-born healers. If a mercenary group had an elven healer, the casualty rate would be greatly reduced. Therefore, most mercenary groups would try their best to recruit an elven member. Healing was an important part of the mercenary group. Now that something like this had happened, some mercenary groups chose to suspend their missions for safety reasons and wait for the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple's investigation. More mercenary groups chose to let their elves stay in the city for the time being. The mercenary groups began to reduce the difficulty of their missions and continued to work. Of course, some mercenary groups were still holding on to the idea of getting lucky. It was said that the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple had sent out many people to search for the elves. Perhaps the elves had already escaped. Outside the guild hall, Kywell looked at everyone and said, If you're still worried, let's rest for a few more days. We'll see how things go before we go on a mission. Although the weather had turned cold, she was still wearing short leather pants that exposed her thighs and a folded boomerang on her back. She looked very serious. As a small mercenary group, the Rose Mercenary Squad had no way to deal with unexpected situations. More importantly, one of their main damage dealers, Evan, was an elf. Leader, we haven't been on a mission for 3 days. If we continue to stop, our family will be stretched thin, the Minotaur demon Dennis said helplessly as he scratched his head. Powerful mercenary groups could hunt high-level monsters and earn high commissions. However, a small mercenary group like the Rose Mercenary Group, whose strongest member was only a level 4 magician, could not earn a generous reward every time they went out on a mission. After deducting the various funds and expenses, there was not much money that could be distributed to each member. The other members had similar expressions. Being a mercenary was a profession that licked blood from the edge of a blade. Even if this kind of thing didn't happen, there would still be many people dying in the hands of magical beasts every day. I also agree to go on a mission. With so many mercenary groups going on missions, as long as we don't go to remote places, we shouldn't encounter those guys. Evan, who was holding his wand, nodded in agreement. He said confidently, also, if those guys really do have designs on us, they might just be giving us free money. Didn't the guild announcement say that those who can provide accurate information will be rewarded with 1 million copper coins? Yes, Magician Evan is very powerful. With him around, we don't have to worry at all. Eva looked at Evan with admiration. According to the current statistics, 21 mercenary groups have been annihilated, including a group with a 7th-level magician. Our Rose mercenary group is no match for them. Kywil shook his head, unmoved. He glanced at everyone, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Then let's vote. Those who agree to go on a mission, raise your hand." Other than Scott and Kywil, everyone raised their hand. Kywil nodded. "All right, since most of you want to go on a mission, we'll do it today. However, we'll try to choose the easiest missions. Also, we'll have to go to places with more people. It'll be safer that way." As Kywil and the others were talking, 2 figures, one big and one small, came out of the guild hall and walked past them. Isn't that Mr. Mac?" Minotaur Demon Dennis said, a little surprised. "It really is." Scott's eyes also lit up. He smiled and greeted them. "Mr. Mac, little boss." Meg heard the voice and turned around. Seeing Kywil and the others standing at the entrance of the guild hall, a hint of surprise appeared on his face. However, they had fought side by side before, so they could be considered old acquaintances. He smiled and nodded. "Oh, it's you guys from the Rose Mercenary Group. What's up? Are you going on a mission today?" Miss Leatherpants, Uncle Minotaur, Uncle Roast Rabbit, and Amy glanced at Evan and Eva, then chose to ignore them. She smiled widely and said, "Hello." Evan and Eva's expressions didn't look too good, but it was all thanks to this pair of father and daughter that they were able to survive last time, so they couldn't say anything. Although they felt a little helpless about their strange nicknames, looking at little Amy's smiling face, their faces were also full of smiles. Kywil smiled at Amy, then looked at Meg and said, "Yes, but Mr. Meg, are you going out of the city today? It's not safe outside the city during this period, so I don't recommend you go out at this time. You probably haven't seen the notice over there, right?" Although Meg and Amy had shown their abilities last time, Meg was after all a chef, not a professional mercenary. It was too easy for him to be in danger with little Amy, who was only 4 years old. "Oh, I saw that. But this time, we're just going to a closer place to find some ingredients. It shouldn't be a problem," Meg said with a smile. He glanced at Evan, who was still arrogant, and then looked at Kywil. "Miss Kywil, where are you going this time? If it's convenient, maybe you can give us a ride and save us the trouble of renting a horse." "Sure. Boss Mag's culinary skills are so superb, we're in for a treat. If it weren't for the fact that the prices at your restaurant are so high, I would definitely go there often." Dennis was quite excited. Chapter 895. Evan took a glance at Meg and said, "Team leader, I think it's best we don't add any new members in this unstable situation. If we don't work well with them, they could drag us down." "That's right. I've heard that those guys target mercenary groups with elves. If we have an elf, the possibility of our mercenary group becoming their target will increase by a lot. This is simply too dangerous for us." Eva nodded in agreement. A contemplative look appeared on Kywil's face. Evan and Eva's words were quite reasonable. All of the major mercenary groups were in a precarious situation right now, as very few powerful beings above the 7th tier would accept mercenary missions from the Union. As such, The 7th-tier magic caster that was slain the day before yesterday was already a top-tier powerhouse that most mercenary groups couldn't match up to. Mercenaries needed to work well together in battle, and a well-coordinated mercenary group could fight enemies above their level. Amy's magic power was indeed quite powerful. She was already a 4th-tier magic caster. Mag looked like an ordinary person, but she didn't believe that he had been able to slay an ironhide bull with a single cleaver because he had practiced his knife skills in the kitchen. However, they were still outsiders to the Rose mercenary squad, and they hadn't even seen each other much, let alone work well together. Kywell looked at Meg with a perplexed expression, and said, "Mr. Meg, the situation might be more serious than you think. You're a restaurant owner, not a mercenary, so there's no need for you to leave the city at this time. Also, you're taking little Amy with you, so this kind of danger is completely avoidable." Meg looked at Kywell and could sense her concern, but he still shook his head with a smile, and said, "I understand, but I've always had good luck, so there shouldn't be any problems. If it's not convenient for you, Ms. Kywell, we'll rent a wildebeest ourselves. If you have the opportunity, you can come to Amy's for a visit." Meg then nodded at Dennis and Scott before leaving with Amy's little hand in his. His request was indeed a bit excessive. Those guys were aiming for the mercenary group. If a weak mercenary group had 2 elves, even if one of them was a half-elf, they would still be the first choice of those guys. However, Meg only mentioned it for the sake of their old friendship. Since they were unwilling, he naturally wouldn't force them. "Captain, Mr. Mack is a loyal man. Last time, we were almost wiped out, but he saved us. If the father and daughter go to the wilderness alone, I'm afraid." Scott looked at Meg and the others' backs. He wanted to say something, but stopped. He looked a little anxious. "Does saving us once mean that we have to die for him? I don't want to be targeted and wiped out just because there's an extra half-elf in the team." Evan pursed his lips. Kywell frowned as he watched the father and daughter walk away. After a moment of silence, he seemed to have made up his mind. He took 2 steps forward and said loudly, "Mr. Meg, come with us." Mag stopped in his tracks and turned to look at Sivir with a hint of surprise on his face. Half an hour later, a horse-drawn carriage full of people was driven out of Chaos City toward the wilderness, surrounded by 4 horses. There were 8 people in the Rose mercenary group. The captain, Kywell, was a 3rd-tier hunter who was good at archery and boomerangs. Scott was a 3rd-tier swordsman. The Minotaur demon, Dennis, was a tank with a giant shield. He had good defense because of his earth element, and he could quickly build an earth wall for the group. Evan, the elven magic caster, was a 4th-tier magic caster. Although he had just broken through, he had become the main damage dealer of the group. He was also the target of protection. Eva was a 1st-tier healing magic caster. She was very weak. The monkey who drove the carriage, Sydney, was in charge of scouting. Scott was also a 3rd-tier swordsman. Sam was in charge of setting up traps. Meg was familiar with the group. Except for a few more scars on their bodies, he could still see them. Meg felt good. In the mercenary profession, people died every day. The place they were going to today was near the Giant's Canyon. It was a rather strange place, named after the dozens of giant footprints in the canyon. Even the forest trolls wouldn't be able to leave behind such giant footprints. It had become an unsolved mystery. Low-level magical beasts roamed the valley all year round, and precious herbs grew here. Because they grew on both sides of the steep cliffs and hidden in the cracks of the rocks, they weren't easy to find. Instead, many mercenaries and herb gatherers who weren't strong enough came here. It was one of the most popular places in the wastelands. "Mr. Mack, you said there was a golden scale deer in the basin next to the giant valley. Is that true?" Dennis, who was sitting opposite Meg, asked Meg in a low voice. Everyone looked at Meg. They were going to accept the mission, but after Meg shared the news with them and agreed to go with them to catch the golden scale deer, they followed Meg to the giant valley. The golden scale deer was an extremely rare 3rd-tier magical beast. It was named for its golden scale-like fur. Both its antlers and its skin were extremely valuable. If they could hunt a golden scale deer, they could sell it for at least 200,000 coppers. This was a very high return for the Rose mercenary group. "This is the information I bought from the guild. The scouts found traces of a golden scale deer and saw it from afar some time ago. I don't know if we'll be lucky enough to see it today. Mag pulled out a piece of parchment that was tied up with a string from his little bag and handed it to Dennis. Although Meg did not know the time limit of the information, he had to make it look like a treasure map. It was as if it would be a waste of 100 gold coins if he did not make it look like a treasure map. Everyone's eyes lit up as they looked at the information in Mag's hands. The parchment meant that this piece of information was at least 7th tier. The starting price was above 10,000, and no more than 10 copies of each piece of information could be made. Dennis hesitated for a moment. Seeing Meg's open expression, he reached out and took the parchment. After a while, he handed it back to Meg and nodded. Mr. Mack is right. This information was just obtained 3 days ago. The golden scale deer did appear there, but there was no news of anyone catching it. Chapter 896. Kywell looked at Meg and said seriously, Mr. Meg is willing to share such precious information with us. Even if we do catch the golden scale deer, it will be up to Mr. Meg to decide how to distribute it. She thought Meg had only heard about it from a mercenary. She did not expect it to be information from the guild. Mag smiled. I've heard that the golden scale deer is not very aggressive, but it is very fast and has a kind of illusion that can confuse people who come close to it. If it were just the two of us, it would be very difficult to catch it. If we catch the golden scale deer, I want the antlers and half the price of the skin. Evan said, You are just providing information. How dare you ask for so much? The antlers are worth at least 50,000 coppers. Aren't you a bit too greedy? Are you sure we don't need to do anything this time? Meg looked at Evan with a smile. Evan felt uncomfortable under Meg's gaze. Thinking of what happened last time, he felt his face heat up. He snorted coldly, turned his face away, and slowly clenched his fists. The Rose mercenary group looked a little embarrassed. Evan was normal, except for his arrogance. But every time he met Meg, he would become a little strange. Kywell said, The Rose mercenary group has no objection to Mr. Meg's distribution. I hope we can cooperate well this time. Meg smiled and nodded. He had been out for a day, so it was natural to take something back. Otherwise, it would not be in line with his character and temperament. Except for Evan and Eva, who rolled her eyes the whole time, Meg and the rest of the Rose mercenary group got along well. 2 hours later, a huge canyon appeared in the distance. The mountain looked like it had been split from the middle by a giant axe. The top half was hidden in the clouds, and it looked very spectacular. That was the giant canyon. From time to time, mercenary groups would pass by, and they couldn't help but take a few more glances at Amy. He had never seen such a young girl in the wastelands. What kind of father would be so ignorant as to bring such a beautiful girl into the wastelands? If she was hurt by a magical beast, it would be a sin. Amy leaned on Meg's shoulder and looked around curiously. Although this was not her first time out of the city, she was still very curious about everything. Fortunately, the people around her were all veteran mercenaries who had been in the wilderness for many years. Otherwise, Meg would not have been able to handle the barrage of questions. The carriage continued to move forward from the side of the giant canyon. There was a nameless basin 5 or 6 kilometers away. Because there were very few magic beasts and precious herbs there, very few mercenary groups would go there. No one wanted to give a name to such a completely uninhabited place. However, that was the destination of Meg's trip. Meg had thought about choosing this place. It was closer to the giant canyon, so it would be easier for the mercenaries to feel safe here and agree to go with him. Even if they didn't meet the Rose mercenary group, Meg's plan was to find a mercenary group with elves and not too strong to form a team. Since he knew that someone was targeting a mercenary group in Chaos City just to catch elves, it would not be like him to not do something. Back then, he had said on the city wall that since someone had come here to provoke him, he would dig a hole and fill it with them. From a hunter's point of view, that place was the most suitable place to reel in the net. If he were the other party, seeing a mercenary group with 2 elves going to that almost uninhabited basin alone was simply like a plate of good food delivered to his door. This was exactly what he wanted to create. Using himself as bait was risky, but it was also the most efficient way. After traveling for another dozen or so minutes, a depression that resembled a sinkhole appeared before their eyes. The horse-drawn carriage arrived at the edge of the depression, and Mag carried Amy to the edge of the depression to look down. The cliff was almost 90 degrees vertical, and it was hundreds of meters deep. There were many dark caves on the stone walls. The basin was about 1 kilometer in diameter, and it was a little dark down there. In the center of the basin was a stone forest. Huge black stones stood tall, but many of them were in disarray. There were also patches of coniferous forest at the edge. The cries of birds and beasts echoed in the basin from time to time, but there was no one in sight. "Wow, what a big basin!" Amy exclaimed in surprise. She opened her arms and was about to jump in. Luckily, Meg caught her in time and looked at Amy helplessly. Although the little one had learned to fly with the Pope's blessing, Meg had asked Amy not to tell anyone about it after they returned to Chaos City. Except for a few people like Crassus and Julian, no one else knew that Amy could fly. The reason was simple: Meg wanted Amy to have a backup plan. A gust of cold and damp wind blew up from the bottom of the basin. Evan shivered and frowned. Is there really a golden scale deer in this godforsaken place? Don't golden scale deer like sunny and dry places? There's nothing wrong with the Union's information. I've been to this basin twice, but I didn't find anything good. Moreover, the sun only shines on the bottom of the valley at noon every day, and it's gone in less than half an hour, Sam said with a smile. Meg thought for a while and smiled. In that case, is it possible that the golden scale deer will appear at the bottom of the valley at that time? Everyone's eyes lit up. If there really was a golden scale deer here, the possibility was not low. Then let's go down first and see if we can find anything else in the basin. Sivir tied her horse to the side and carefully led the way down a small path. Meg looked around, and his eyes paused for a moment on a rocky mountain not far away. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly, and he walked down the basin with Amy in his arms. In the wilderness, in a dense forest, in a house hidden by trees, a demon rushed in and said excitedly, "Boss, I just received news that a small mercenary group has entered the basin next to the giant valley. There are 2 piglets in the group, a male and a small one. The scout said that the small one is the best and can be sold for a good price. It's worth as much as the piglets we caught these days." Chapter 897. The process of searching in the basin was somewhat boring. There were almost no magic beasts, and there were only a few wild beasts. Only pheasants and hares would occasionally pass by. Even so, Sivir and the others were still extremely cautious as they walked. Because in this wilderness, not only were powerful magic beasts fatal, but even a small poisonous bug could take one's life. Especially in a dark and damp place like the basin, snakes, scorpions, and poisonous bugs were the most common. However, their journey was quite smooth. The biggest scare was when a 10-meter-long python pounced out of a nearby cave. As soon as it appeared, it was burned to ashes by a fireball from Remi, who was eager to give it a try. Kywell walked in front with a torch in his hand. Costa and Skoll walked on his left and right. Dennis walked at the back with his shield, protecting Meg, Amy, Evan, and Eva in the middle. Monkey climbed the vines on the cliff and swayed from side to side, scouting from high up, and occasionally whistling to pass on information. They searched for an hour, and almost turned the bottom of the basin upside down. Finally, they found a soft golden scale next to a boulder with a pale golden metallic luster. This is the scale of a golden scale deer. I saw one when I was young, but unfortunately, it ran away. I only found a few scales that looked exactly like this one. Sam picked up the scale and examined it carefully for a while with a look of certainty. Great, it seems that the information was correct. The golden scale deer is very likely to appear in this area. Dennis rubbed his hands excitedly, and the others could not hide their excitement. Mag took a closer look at this stretch of huge rocks. It was about 100 square meters in size, and there was a hint of gold in the white rocks. They were glowing under the light of the fire, but they shouldn't be valuable. Otherwise, even if it was a 600-meter-high cliff, someone would try their best to move all of them up. His gaze landed on the platform. Mag looked at the center of the slanted giant rock. There was a clear spring in the center of the giant rock like a pearl. "Is Lulu here to drink water?" Amy asked curiously. Meg smiled and nodded. "If there is a reason for it to come here, I'm afraid it is. If that's the case, then let's wait here for the rabbit to appear." A smile also appeared on Sivia's face. Perhaps this hunt was going to be easier than she had anticipated. Sam put down the big bag on his back and smiled. "I'll set the trap. The one that ran away last time, I won't make the same mistake this time. There's still an hour and a half until noon. You set the trap, and I'll make lunch." Mag took a look at his watch with a smile before making his way over to a nearby cave with a few pheasants that he had just caught. That was a high vantage point, so it was very suitable for observation. Amy trotted with her short legs to keep up. With everyone's help, the trap was quickly set up around the boulder. Even Meg, who was roasting pheasants and cooking chicken soup, couldn't help but marvel at the series of traps. It was like a piece of art. Everyone retreated from the range of the trap. Sam carried out the final restoration work and then dispelled the aura left behind by everyone. By the time Sam retreated, there were no traces of people around the boulder, nor were there any traces of traps. "Looks like we still have time to eat chicken." Meg smiled as he looked at everyone crawling into the cave. "This smells so good. Mr. Mac, if it weren't for the fact that we can't afford to hire you, I would invite you to join our mercenary group and cook for us every day." Dennis took a deep breath and praised. Everyone couldn't help but salivate at the sight of the crispy golden roast chicken on the grill, the thick white chicken soup that Mag had pulled out from somewhere, and the rich aroma wafting through the air. "I'm not eating. I brought my own food," Evan said in a cold and haughty voice. Eva tried her best to shift her gaze away from the roast pheasants, and said with a disdainful expression, "I'm not eating either. Roast pheasants, 1 pheasant for each of us. After eating, you can even drink a bowl of thick chicken soup." Meg didn't even look at the two of them, and handed out bowls to everyone with a smile. He then gestured for everyone to take their own roast pheasants, and handed an entire roast pheasant to Amy. These two bitches wanted him to make roast pheasants for them. They must have been hit in the head by a door. Evan's expression stiffened at the same time, and his facial muscles twitched as he looked at Meg, who had completely ignored them, and he almost couldn't contain the anger in his heart. "Mage Evan. Have some fruit." Eva took out an orange from her backpack, and carefully peeled it before handing it to Evan. "I'm not hungry." Evan raised his hand, and the orange fell to the ground. He then turned around with a dark expression. Eva withdrew her hand awkwardly, but there was no hint of anger on her face. Instead, she looked at Evan with an even more cautious expression. Everyone carried over some rocks and sat down. Just the aroma of the roast pheasant was enough to make them drool. Normally, when they came to the wilderness, they would only bring some dried food with them, and would never have the opportunity to enjoy something like this. After all, Meg was the best chef in Chaos City. Kyle glanced at Evan and Eva, and then at Meg. He hesitated momentarily, but still chose to sit down in silence. He also picked up a roast pheasant and took a whiff. A smile appeared on his face, and he broke off a drumstick before taking a bite. Under the crispy skin, there was a tender and juicy chicken meat. The aroma seeped into the skin, and the roast pheasant's delicious flavor was brought out to the extreme. It was delicious and crispy, and all of the taste buds on the tongue were trembling. "This roast pheasant is so delicious." Chiwill's eyes were twinkling like little stars. It was as delicious as Meg's roast beef last time. Pheasants were the most common wild animal in the wilderness, and they would occasionally catch them to satisfy their hunger. However, even Sam, who was the best at roast pheasant, could not compare to Meg's roast pheasant. Moreover, this was roasted in the wilderness under such poor conditions and in such a hurry. If it was in his kitchen, it would be even more delicious. "Oh my God, Mr. Mac, I think you're the god of cookery. No one can make food as delicious as yours. If we can catch a golden scale deer this time, I must go to Mr. Mac's restaurant for a few meals. Count me in." Everyone praised Meg as they ate, and their faces were full of happiness. Meg smiled. As a chef, the greatest sense of accomplishment was naturally from the recognition of his customers. He would never get tired of hearing praise. The whole pot of chicken soup was finished until not even the bones were left. Everyone burped one after another. A ray of sunlight fell on the edge of the basin, and then began to move toward the center. Chapter 898. Shush. Look, what did I find? Little Lulu is there, Amy whispered, pointing to the cave on the opposite cliff. That's it, the golden scale deer. Sam's eyes lit up with excitement, but he still lowered his voice and said, Everyone, find a rock and hide. The golden scale deer is very vigilant and timid. If it finds us, it probably won't come here again. This is an adult golden scale deer, and its fur is of the best quality. Hearing this, everyone hid behind the rocks, carefully watching the golden scale deer. Their eyes were filled with amazement. Mag was also rather surprised to see this. The deer was about the same size as a normal seeker deer, but its body was covered in a layer of shimmering golden scales that resembled fish scales. Under the light of the sun, the scales shimmered like fireworks, and there was a pair of curved horns on its head that seemed to have been forged from pure gold. It was the type of creature that attracted all attention as soon as it appeared. The sunlight was like a curtain that was gradually being lifted, slowly moving forward under the basin. The dark basin was illuminated, and the dampness was suppressed by the sunlight. The little beasts crawled out of their caves and looked up, enjoying the short period of sunlight shining on them. The giant rock was also illuminated by the sun, with a little bit of golden light, as if it was sprinkled with golden powder. The clear spring in the middle was also rippling with dazzling light. The golden scale deer's big black eyes scanned the surroundings vigilantly. It waited for 10 minutes until the sun covered the whole basin, then carefully jumped down from the steep cliff. The cliff was almost vertical, with only a few protruding rocks, but the golden scale deer jumped directly from the cliff, landing lightly and accurately on the protruding rocks. It was like a little fairy jumping down from the cliff. After landing on the ground, the golden scale deer stopped again, vigilantly observing the boulders and the surroundings. It stopped every 3 steps, its ears twitching, as if it was observing the surroundings at all times. Sivir gripped the boomerang hanging from her waist, and said in a low voice, even though Sam has set up a series of traps, be prepared to attack as a safety precaution. Remember, it's best not to damage its fur or horn. Otherwise, the price will be drastically reduced. Everyone silently pulled out their weapons, staring at the golden scale deer that was slowly walking toward the boulder. The cave was about 10 meters above the boulder, which was the best place to launch a long-range attack. At the same time, it was also very easy to go down. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Are we going to attack? Remi rubbed her little hands with an excited expression on her little face. 2 small flames had already begun to dance on her little hands. Amy, you can't use the fireball magic. Scott and Skoll also grabbed onto the vines and slid down. Evan stood up and began to chant a spell. Blue light began to converge on his wand, and he pointed it downward, upon which a layer of ice began to materialize above the trap. However, before Scott and Skoll could land, the golden scale deer let out a loud moan and jumped out of the trap with its legs. Bang! The ice cover that had not yet fully formed was smashed into pieces. The boomerang brushed past the deer's butt and hit the edge of the trap. Chapter 899. Only by thinking of all the possible changes that could occur could this be called a qualified serial trap. Sam's family had been hunters for generations. Although it was not enough to deal with powerful magical beasts, it was effective against magical beasts that were not very aggressive and destructive. However, the golden scale deer, which had just escaped from the trap, was obviously not willing to give up. The boomerang whistled again, the 2 humans who had landed on the ground and were rushing toward it with long swords, and the ice walls rising in all directions. The golden scale deer's eyes flashed with a hint of ferocity. Oh! With a sharp cry, the golden scale deer's golden scales suddenly stood up. The sun fell on the scales, reflecting a dazzling golden light that shot in all directions. The net that covered the deer instantly turned into charred ropes, as if it had been burned by fire. The ice walls around it were cut into countless pieces. Looking in that direction, the crowd subconsciously avoided the golden light. They could not help but have a trace of confusion in their eyes, as if they had seen something wonderful. Some of them stood there in a daze. Is this an illusion? A hint of surprise appeared on Mag's face as he looked at Evan, who was still in the middle of casting his spell, and Eva, who was still staring blankly into space. His spiritual power seemed to be too powerful, so he wasn't affected in the slightest. Miss Leatherpants and the others are also stunned. It's like they're made of wood, but in this case, that little Lulu is going to escape. Amy poked her head out and pointed at the golden scale deer, which had just crawled out of the trap group and was a little lame in its right foreleg. Although surprised that Amy was not affected at all, Meg glanced at the golden scale deer that had run dozens of meters away in the blink of an eye and quickly asked, "Amy, can you catch it?" "Of course." Amy nodded, then pointed her little finger at the golden scale deer that had almost reached the bottom of the cliff and was about to start climbing. With a serious face, she called out, "Little Lulu, stop." The golden scale deer stopped in its tracks, as if it had been immobilized by a spell. This? Meg was taken aback. He thought that Amy would use some sort of frost spell, but he didn't expect her to freeze it in place with just a light tap. If they had known this would happen, they wouldn't have spent half an hour setting up the trap and then trying to catch the golden scale deer. This is the immobilization technique that Master Julian just taught me. It's also called the domain of extreme frost. Everything in the area will be instantly frozen, Amy explained as she looked at Meg with an expression that said, "Praise me, awesome." Meg smiled and patted Amy's head. The little girl was a fast learner, and she often skipped grades to learn more advanced things. Domains were generally something that only magicians above the 7th level could play with. Except for some gifted races, without enough understanding of magic and a certain degree of talent, most magicians could not understand what a domain was. Amy was only a 4th level magician, but she had already started to play with domains. If this were to spread, it would probably cause a stir. The golden scale deer was immobilized, and the illusion was lifted. Everyone's faces showed a trace of confusion, as if they had forgotten what had just happened. Oh no! The golden scale deer. Sivir was the first to react, and her expression changed slightly as she cast her gaze toward the trap, only to find that it was completely empty. Everyone came back to their senses when they heard this. Their expressions changed slightly. They did not expect that they would fall for the golden scale deer's innate illusion. The golden scale deer that was so close to being in their hands had run away just like that. "It's okay. Look over there, little Lulu has been immobilized by me." Amy's crisp voice sounded, and she pointed at the golden scale deer at the foot of the cliff in the distance. Everyone looked in that direction. The golden scale deer was indeed there. Its front hooves were raised, and its hind hooves were kicked back. It seemed to be in a running state, but at this time, it was motionless, as if it had been immobilized. How is this possible? Evan looked at the golden scale deer. Even his magic had been destroyed by this golden scale deer twice, but it had been immobilized by Amy so easily. He was shocked and a little ashamed. Everyone's faces were full of shock. There was no ice wall, no trace of ice, and not even a trace of the golden scale deer's struggle. What kind of powerful magic could immobilize the golden scale deer so easily? And it was Amy who had done all this. It seems that someone just said that some people would only watch from the sidelines. "Uncle, is that you?" Amy looked at the gloomy Evan and asked with a smile. "Me." Evan's face alternated between red and white, and he turned his head away angrily. Eva opened her mouth, but after looking at Amy, she closed it, but there was still some resentment in her eyes. A faint smile appeared on Mag's face. As expected, he was more pleased to see Amy's performance than to Flex. He turned to Sivir and said, "It's only immobilized, it's not dead, so it's best if you can tie it up as soon as possible." "Okay." Kywell untied a roll of rope with some complicated runes hanging from his waist and walked quickly to the golden scale deer. He quickly put the rope around its neck, tied all 4 of its feet together, and put it on the ground. This was a spirit binding rope made by a magician. It was one of the most common equipment used by mercenaries. Magic beasts that were bound by the spirit binding rope would lose their ability to struggle. Chapter 900. The shrill laughter echoed in the empty basin like that of a ghost. The mercenaries, who were still immersed in the joy of their harvest, were startled. They immediately got into their battle stances and looked up in surprise. There were 7 people on the cliff above. Although they looked very small due to the great height difference, it was still obvious that they were a team of demons, orcs, and forest trolls. The tall guy in the middle, who was burning with ghostly green flames, was especially chilling. "Get ready to fight." Sivir gripped the boomerang tightly in her hand as she looked up with a grave expression at the people who had appeared above her. There was an old saying among the mercenaries, "Magic beasts are not scary, but mercenaries who have their eyes on you are scary." Those who dared to target mercenaries were usually far more powerful than the other party. Under such circumstances, the weaker party was basically powerless. However, because of the strong intervention of the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple in Chaos City, there were few conflicts among the mercenaries. Even if there were conflicts over magic beasts or herbs, most of them were settled with fair duels. However, it was clear that many of these mercenaries had their eyes on the golden scale deer they had caught. "What do they mean?" Eva's voice was trembling, and her face was very pale. Those words made her think of some terrible things. "These guys. I'm afraid they are coming for us." Evan's face was also very pale, and his eyes were full of fear. Thinking of what had happened in the past few days, and the gruesome corpses of the mercenaries who had been carried back to Chaos City, the mercenaries' faces were very grim. "They are still coming. That guy should be an 8th-tier demon, right?" Meg looked up. His eyes were far sharper than ordinary people. His gaze lingered on the demon with ghostly flames for a while, and then swept over the orcs and forest trolls beside him. Most of them were between 6th tier and 7th tier. With such strength, they could easily wipe out all the mercenary groups in the wilderness, unless they encountered some big boss who needed to find something in the wilderness. The combination of demons, beast men, and forest trolls, as well as the insulting title of Piggy, all of this proved that these fellows were the culprits behind the recent massacre of the mercenary groups. In other words, they were the evil mercenary groups that specifically targeted wandering elves. Remi covered her ears and raised her head to shout, "What a horrible laugh. Can you please shut up?" The laughter stopped abruptly. The demon lowered his head and looked at Amy. His face was covered in a dark green flame, and he stared at her with a pair of scarlet eyes. "You are so ugly. Can you please cover your face?" Amy said disdainfully. The demon was covered in flames. He roared, "Little brat, I know you are, but if you piss me off, I will make you wish you were dead." As soon as he finished speaking, the demon took a step forward and jumped down from above, diving down like a blue fireball. The demons, orcs, and trolls also quickly climbed down the cliff and rushed down at an extremely fast speed. "Release the signal flare, monkey." Kywell didn't appear to be panicking. Instead, he calmly issued an order. However, his hand was a little pale from holding the boomerang too tightly. "All right." The monkey's hands trembled as he took out a small bamboo tube from his pocket. The Grey Temple's symbol was printed on it, and he pulled it toward the sky. A magical fireball flew out of the bamboo tube and flew into the sky with a whoosh. It then exploded into a ball of bright red flames in the air and didn't dissipate. "How dare you piss him off? None of us are going to live now." Evan glowered at Amy with a twisted expression. "Don't tell me I'm going to be a coward like you, not even daring to fart." Meg stood in front of Amy and looked at Evan with a mocking expression. This guy was even worse than he had imagined. "You." Evan's face was flushed red, and his wand was already glowing with blue light. "Shut up. Focus and prepare to fight." Kywell looked back at Evan with disgust in his eyes. A guy who blamed his teammates in the face of a strong enemy would never be a reliable teammate. Uncle, do you want to have a taste of the fireball? Or is it the smell of ice hockey? Remi poked her head out and asked with a smile. Evan's expression changed several times, and he withdrew his wand in the end. He looked at the ball of green flames descending from the sky with horror in his eyes, and he had completely lost all of his will to fight. Boom! The green fireball hit the ground 10 meters away from them, shaking the ground. Dust and debris flew everywhere, and the surrounding stone walls fell. Everyone swayed a little before they could steady themselves. The golden scale deer that was tied up by the spirit binding rope was scared to death. Dennis, who was standing in front of everyone with his shield, was knocked back a meter by the impact. He couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Cha, cha, cha. Accompanied by the sound of stones being crushed, everyone's hearts were in their throats. To be able to jump down from a cliff that was hundreds of meters high and remain unscathed, one had to be at least a level 7 existence. Furthermore, it had to be a demon with an extremely powerful body. Today, the Rose mercenary squad could not avoid the fate of being wiped out. The footsteps finally stopped, and a 3-meter-tall, pitch-black and shriveled demon appeared before everyone. Its body was riddled with indentations, and all of them were burning with ghostly green will-o-wisps. It was almost like a skeleton with a layer of skin on it. It looked at everyone with a grin, and said, "It's useless to release the signal flare. By the time those idiots from the Grey Temple get here, you'll already be dead." Everyone's heart skipped a beat. They had encountered the worst outcome. This one is really weak. It's even weaker than the old thing from 2 days ago. Is Chaos City full of useless people? Where did they get the guts to go against us so openly? Yeah, but the quality this time is not bad. A male piglet is good enough to make up the numbers. That high-quality piglet can be sold at a sky-high price. No matter if it's sent to Rodu or the Demon Islands, it will definitely be sold at an auction. It's not just the piglet. The 2 women today are not bad either. The one over there has big breasts and a round butt. Looks like she will last longer than the ones from 2 days ago. The one over there will probably die after 1 use. The rest of the orcs and trolls had also reached the bottom of the basin. They gathered around and commented on the group. Their greedy eyes swept over Amy and Kywil unscrupulously. The members of the Rose mercenary squad could not hide their anger. Scott and Skoll held their longswords tightly, and Dennis stood in front of them with his shield. He had no intention of backing down. Eva's face was as white as a sheet. She subconsciously leaned against Evan and clutched the corner of his shirt tightly. "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.